Chapter 42 of Gretchen by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. Harold and the Diamonds. When Harold sprang upon the train as it was moving from the station and entered the rear car, he found Billy and Peterkin near the door, the latter buttonholing Judge St. Clair, to whom he was talking loudly and angrily of Wilson, who had brought the suit against him. "Yes, I see. I know. But all that will come out on the trial," the judge said, trying to silence him. But Peterkin held on until his eye caught Harold, when he at once let the judge go, and seating himself beside the young man, began in a soft, coaxing tone for him. "I don't see why in thunder you are going agin me, who have allus been your friend, and gin you work when you couldn't git it anywheres else, and I can't imagine what you're going to say or what you know." Harold's face was very red, but his manner was respectful as he replied, "You cannot be more sorry than I am that I am subpoenaed as a witness against you. I did not seek it. I could not help it, but being a witness, I must answer the questions truthfully." "Thunder and lightning, man, of course you must. Don't I know that?" the irascible Peterkin growled, getting angry at once. "Of course you must answer questions, but you needn't blab out stuff they don't ask you, so as to lead 'em on. I know 'em, the bloodhounds. They'll squeeze you dry once let 'em get an inkling you know somethin' more. Now if this goes agin me I'm out at least $30,000, and between you and I don't mind giving a cool 2,000 or 3 or maybe 5 right out of pocket, cash down, to anybody whose testimony without being a lie. I don't want nobody swear false, remember, but heavens and earth, can't a body forget a little and keep back a lot if they want to?" "What are you trying to say to me?" Harold asked, his face pale with resentment, as he suspected the man's motive. "Say to you? Nothin'. Only that I'll give $5,000 down to the chap whose testimony gets me off and flings Wilson." "Mr. Peterkin," Harold said, looking the old wretch fully in the face, "if you are trying to bribe me, let me tell you at once that I am not to be bought. I shall not volunteer information, but shall answer truthfully whatever is asked me." "Go to thunder, then. I always knew you were a bad egg," Peterkin roared, and as there was nothing to be made from Harold, he changed his seat to the one his son was occupying. Left to himself, Harold had time to think of the diamonds, which indeed had not been absent from his thoughts a moment since Jerry gave them to him. They were closely buttoned in his coat pocket, where they burned like fire, as he wondered where and how Jerry had found them. "In the Tramp House it must have been," he said to himself. "But who put them there, and how did she chance to find them, and why did she look so wild and excited, so like a crazy person when she gave them to me, bidding me let no one see them?" These questions he could not answer, and his brain was all in a whirl when the train reached Springfield, and with the others he registered himself at the hotel. Suddenly there came back to him, with horrible distinctness, the words Jerry had spoken to him years ago, when he walked homeward with her from the Park house, where he had been questioned so closely by Mrs. Tracy with regard to her diamonds and what he had been doing in the house on the morning of their disappearance. "I believe I know where the diamonds are," she had said, and in his excitement he had scarcely noticed it, but it came back to him now with fearful significance as after the gas was lighted he sat alone in a little reception room opening from one of the parlors. Did Jerry know where they were, and had not spoken? And if so, was she not guilty of trying to shield another? For that she took them herself he never for a moment dreamed. It was someone else, and she knew and did not tell. He was certain of it now, as every incident connected with her strange sickness came back to him, when she seemed to be doing penance for another's fault. She had called herself an accessory, and that was what she was, or rather what the world would call her if it knew. To him she was Jerry, the girl he loved, and he would defend her to the bitter end, no matter how culpable she had been in keeping silence so long. But who took them? That was the question puzzling him so much as he sat thinking, with his head bent down, and so absorbed that he did not hear a step in the adjoining room, or know that Peterkin had seated himself just where a large mirror showed him distinctly the young man in the next room, who he recognized at once, though Harold never moved for a few moments or lifted his head. At last, however, he unbuttoned his coat, and after glancing cautiously around to make sure no one was near, he took the box from his pocket, and holding the stones to the light, examined them carefully, taking in his hand first the earrings and then the pin, and holding them in such a way that 2 or 3 times they flashed directly in the eyes of the cruel man watching him. "Yes, they are Mrs. Tracy's diamonds. There can be no mistake," he whispered, just as he became conscious that there was someone in the door looking at him. Quick as thought he put the box out of sight while Peterkin's voice, exultant and hateful, called out, "Hello, Mr. Prayer Book! Your piety won't let you keep back a darn thing you know agin me. But it lets you have in your possession diamonds which I'd e'en a'most swear was them stones Miss Tracy lost years ago and suspected you of takin'. I know the box, anyway. I heard it described so often, and I believe I know them diamonds. I seen 'em in the lookin'-glass settin' in t'other room, and seen you look all round like a thief afore you opened 'em. So fork over, and mebbe you can give me back May Jane's pin you stole at the party the night Mr. Arthur came home. Fork over, I say." Too much astonished at first to speak, Harold looked at the man who had attacked him so brutally, while his hand closed tightly over the diamonds in his pocket as if fearing they might be wrenched from him by force. "Will you fork over, or shall I call the perlice?" Peterkin asked. "Call the police as soon as you like," Harold replied, "but I shall not give you the diamonds." "Then you own that you've got 'em. That's half the battle," Peterkin said, coming close up to him and looking at him with a meaning smile more detestable than any menace could have been. "I know you've got 'em, and I can ruin you if I try, and then what'll your doxy think of you? Will she refuse my bail for a thief and treat me as if I was dirt?" "What do you mean, sir?" Harold demanded, feeling intuitively that by his doxy Jerry was meant, and feeling a great horror, too, lest by some means her name should be mixed up with the affair before she had a chance to explain. The reference to Billy was a puzzle, but Peterkin did not long leave him in doubt. "I mean that you think yourself very fine, and always have, and that our gal of the carpet-bag thinks herself fine too, and refused my bill for you who ain't a cent in the world. I seen it in her face when I twitted her on it, and she riz up agin me like a catamount. But I'll be even with you both yet. I've got you in my power, young man, but—" and here he came a step or two nearer to Harold, and dropping his voice to a whisper said, "I shan't do nothin' nor say nothin' till you've gin your evidence, and if you can hold your tongue, I will. You tickle me and I'll tickle you. See?" Harold was too indignant to reply, and feeling that he was degrading himself every moment he spent in the presence of such a man, he left the room without a word, and went to his own apartment, but not to sleep, for never had he spent so wretched a night as that which followed his interview with Peterkin. Of what the man could do to him he had no fear. His anxiety was all for Jerry. Where did she find the diamonds, and for whom had she kept silence so long? And what would be said of the act when it was known, as it might be, though not from him? 2 or 3 times he arose, and lighting the gas, examined the diamonds carefully to see if there was not some mistake. But there could be none. He had seen them on the lady's person, and had heard them described so accurately that he could not be mistaken, and then the box was the same he had once seen when Jack took him to his mother's room to show him what Uncle Arthur had brought. That was a tortoise shell of an oval shape and lined with blue satin, and this was a tortoise shell, oval-shaped and lined with blue satin. Harold felt, when at last the daylight shone into his room, that if it had tarried a moment longer he must have gone mad. He was very white and haggard, and there were dark rings under his eyes when he went down to the office, where the first person he met was Billy, who also looked pale and worn, with a different expression upon his face from anything Harold had ever seen before. It was as if all life and hope had gone, leaving him nothing to care for. In his anxiety and worry about the diamonds, Harold had scarcely given a thought to what Peterkin had said of Jerry's refusal of Billy, for it seemed so improbable that the latter would presume to offer himself to her. But at sight of Billy's face it came back to him with a throb of pity for the man, and a thrill of joy for himself, for whom Peterkin had said his son was rejected. "Does Billy know of the diamonds, I wonder?" he thought. As if to answer the question in the negative, Billy came quickly forward and, offering his hand, bade Harold good morning, and then motioning him to a seat, took one beside him, and began. "I'm awful sorry, Hal, that you are mixed up in this, but I suppose you must tell the truth." "Yes, I must tell the truth," Harold said. "Father will be so mad," Billy continued. "I wish I could testify for you, but I can't. You were there, I want, and all I know father told me. But don't volunteer information." "No," Harold said slowly, wishing that the ocean were rolling between him and this detestable suit. Once he resolved to go to Judge St. Clair, deliver up the diamonds, and tell him all he knew about them, but this would be bringing Jerry into the matter, and so he changed his mind, and wandered aimlessly about the town until it was time for him to appear at the courthouse, where a crowd was gathering. It was late before the suit known as Wilson versus Peterkin was called, and later still when Harold took the stand. White and trembling so that both his hands and his knees were shaking visibly, he looked more like a criminal than a witness, and he was so agitated and preoccupied, too, that at first his answers were given at random, as if he hardly knew what he was saying. Nor did he, for over and beyond the sea of faces confronting him, Judge St. Clair's wondering and curious, Billy's wondering too, Wilson's disappointed and surprised, and Peterkin's threatening and exultant by turns, he saw only Jerry coming to see him in the lane and asking him to keep the diamonds for her, saw her too away back years ago in the little room with her fever-stained cheeks and shorn head, talking the strangest things of prisons and substitutes and accessories, and assuring someone that she would never tell and was going for him if necessary. Who was that man? Where was he now? And why had he imposed this terrible secret upon Jerry? These were the thoughts crowding through his brain while he was being questioned as to what he knew of the agreement between the plaintiff and defendant while in the office of the latter. Once a thought of Maude crossed his mind with a keen pang of regret, as he remembered the lovely face which had smiled so fondly upon him, mistaking his meaning utterly, and appropriating to herself the love he was trying to tell her was another's. And with thoughts of Maude there came a thought of Arthur, the very first which Harold had given him. Arthur, the crazy man, who himself had hidden the diamonds, and for whom Jerry was ready to sacrifice so much. It was clear as daylight to him now, the anxiety and strain were over, and those who were watching him so intently as he gave his answers at random with the sweat pouring down his face, were electrified at the start he gave as he came to himself and realized for the first time where he was and why he was there. Arthur would never see Jerry wronged. She was safe. And with this load lifted from him, he gave his whole attention to the business on hand, answering the questions now clearly and distinctly. When at last the lawyer said to him, "Repeat what you can remember of the conversation which took place between the plaintiff and defendant on the morning of 1800 , he gave one sorry look at poor Billy, who was the picture of shame and confusion, and then in a clear distinct voice, which filled every corner of the room, told what he had heard said in his presence, and what he knew of the transaction, proving conclusively that the plaintiff was right and Peterkin a rascal, and this in the face of the man who had asked him not to blab, and who shook his fist at him threateningly as the narrative went on. "Would you believe the defendant under oath?" was asked at the close, and Harold answered promptly, "Under oath, yes." "Would you if not under oath?" "If an untruth would be to his advantage, no." And then Harold was through. As he stepped down from the witness stand, old Peterkin arose, so angry that at first he could scarcely articulate his words. "You dog! You liar! You thief!" he screamed. "To stand there and lie so about me! I'll teach you! I'll show 'em what you are! If there's a perlice, I call on 'em to arrest this feller for them diamonds of Miss Tracy's. They are in his pocket, or was last night. I seen 'em myself, and he doesn't deny it." By this time the courthouse was in wild confusion, as the spectators arose from their seats and pressed forward to where Peterkin stood denouncing Harold, who looked as if he were going to faint, as Billy hastened to his side, whispering, "Lean on me, and I will get you out of this. Father is mad." But order was soon restored, though not until Peterkin had yelled again, as Harold was leaving the room. "Search him, I tell you! Don't let him escape! He's got 'em in his pocket!
Miss Tracy's diamonds! Lord of heavens! Don't you remember the row there was about 'em years ago?"
Of what followed during the next hour Harold knew very little. There was a crowd around him, and cries of, "He is going to faint," while Billy's stammering voice called pleadingly, "Stand back! Can't you give him air?" Then a deluge of water in his face, then a great darkness, and the voices sounded a long way off, and he felt so tired and sleepy, and thought of Jerry and Maude, and lived over again the scene in the Tramp House, when he found the former in the bag, and felt her arms around his neck as he staggered with her through the snow, wondering why she was so heavy, and why her feet were dragging on the ground. When he came more fully to himself, he was in a little room in the courthouse, and Billy's arm was lying protectingly across his shoulder, while Billy's father was bellowing like a bull.
"Be you goin' to let him go? Ain't you goin' to get a writ and arrest him? Why don't you handcuff him, somebody? And you, Bill, be you a fool to stand there hugging him as if he was a gal? What do you mean?"
"Hal is my friend, father. He never took the diamonds," Billy answered sadly, while Judge St. Clair, who had the box of jewels in his hand and was looking very anxious, turned to the angry man, clamoring so loudly for a writ, and said sternly, "Even if Harold took the diamonds, which he did not, I am certain of that, there is some mistake which he will explain. But if he took them, it is too late to arrest him. A theft committed 10 years ago cannot be punished now."
"May the Lord give you sense," Peterkin rejoined with a derisive laugh. "Don't tell me that a body can't be punished for stealing diamonds if 'twas done 100 years ago."
"But it is true, nevertheless," the judge replied. Turning to another lawyer who was standing near, Peterkin asked,
"Is that so, Square? Is it so writ? Is that the law?"
"That is the law," was the response.
"Well, I'll be condemned if that don't beat all," Peterkin exclaimed. "Can't be sent to prison? I swaw, there ain't no law nor justice for nobody but me, and I must be kicked to the wall. I'll give up and won't try to be nobody, I vum."
And as he talked he walked away to ruminate upon the injustice of the law, which could not touch Harold Hastings, but could throw its broad arms tightly around himself. Meanwhile the judge had ordered a carriage and taken Harold with him to his private room in the hotel, where the hardest part for Hal was yet to come. "Now, my boy," the judge said, after he had made Harold lie down upon the couch and had locked the door, "now tell me all about it. How came you by the diamonds?" It was such a pitiful, pleading, agonized face which lifted itself from the cushion and looked at Judge St. Clair as Harold began. "I cannot tell you now, I must not, but by and by perhaps I can. They were handed to me to keep by someone, just for a little while. I cannot tell you who it was. I think I would die sooner than do it. Certainly I would rather go to prison, as Peterkin wishes me to." There was a thoughtful, perplexed look in the judge's face as he said, "This is very strange, Harold, that you cannot tell who gave them to you, and with some people will be construed against you." "I know it, but I would rather bear it than have that person's name brought in question," was Harold's reply. "Do you think that person took them?" the judge asked. "No, 1,000 times no," and Harold leaped to his feet and began to pace the floor hurriedly. "They never took them, never. I'd swear to that with my life. Don't talk any more about it, please. I can't bear it. I have gone through so much today, and last night I never slept a wink. Oh, I am so tired." And with a groan he threw himself again upon the couch, and closing his eyes dropped almost instantly into a heavy slumber, from which the judge did not rouse him until after dinner, when he ordered some refreshment sent to his room, and himself awoke the young man, who could only swallow a cup of coffee and a part of a biscuit. "I am so tired," he kept repeating, "but I shall be better in the morning," and long before the night train had come he was in bed sleeping off the effects of the day's excitement. The next morning when he went down to the office he was surprised and bewildered at the crowd which gathered around him, the friends who had come on the train to stand by and defend him, if necessary, and as the home faces he had known all his life looked kindly into his, and the familiar voices of his boyhood told him of sympathy for and faith in him, while hand after hand took his in a friendly clasp, that of Dick St. Clair clinging to his with a grasp which said plainer than words could have done, "I believe in you, Hal, and am so sorry for you. The tension of his nerves gave way entirely, and sinking down in their midst he cried like a child when freed from some terrible danger. He had not thought before that he cared for himself what people said, but he knew now that he did, and this assurance of confidence from his friends unnerved him for a time. Then, dashing away his tears and lifting up his face, on which his old winning smile was breaking, he said, "Excuse me for this weakness. Only girls should cry, but I have borne so much, and your coming was such a surprise. Thank you all. I cannot say what I feel. I should cry again if I did." "Never mind, old boy," Dick's cheery voice called out. "We know what you would say. We came to help you, just a few of us, but if anything had really happened to you, why all Shannondale would have turned out to the rescue." "Thank you, Dick," Harold said. Then, as his eye fell for the first time upon Tom, he exclaimed with a glad ring in his voice, "And you too, Tom." "Yes, I thought I'd come with the crowd and see the fun," Tom answered indifferently as he walked away by himself. Tom had said very little on the train or after he reached the hotel, but no one had listened with more eagerness to every detail of the matter than he had done, and all that morning he was busy gathering up every item of information, and listening to the guesses as to who the person could be who gave the diamonds to Harold. The jewels had been identified by his father and by himself, although an identification was scarcely necessary, as Harold had distinctly said, "They are the Tracy diamonds. The person who gave them to me said so." But who was the person? That was the question puzzling the heads of all the Shannondale people as the morning wore on and each went where he liked. At last, toward noon, Tom found himself near Harold in front of the courthouse, and going up to him said, "Hal, I want to talk to you a little while." "Yes," Hal said, and selecting a retired corner, Tom began. "Hal, I've never shown any great liking for you, and I don't suppose I have any, but I don't like to see a man kicked for nothing, and so I came over with the rest." "Thank you, Tom," Harold replied. "I don't think you ever did like me, and I don't think I cared if you didn't, but I'm glad you came. Is that all you wish to say to me?" "No," Tom answered. "Jerry is very sick." "Jerry sick? Oh, Tom!" It was a cry of almost despair, as Harold thought. What if she should die and the people never know? "She had an awful headache when you left her in the lane, and the next morning she was raving mad. Kind of a brain fever, I guess." Harold was stupefied, but he managed to ask, "Does she talk much? What does she say?" There was alarm in his voice, which the sagacious Tom detected, and strengthened in his suspicion, he replied, "Nothing about the diamonds, and the Lord knows I hope she won't." "What do you mean?" Harold asked in a frightened tone. "Don't you worry," Tom replied. "I wouldn't harm Jerry any more than you would. Well, Hal, you are a trump. Yes, you are, to hold your tongue and let some think you are the culprit. Hal, Jerry gave you the diamonds. I saw her do it in the lane as I came up to you. I did not think of it at the time, but afterward it came to me that you took something from her and slipped it into your pocket, and that you both looked scared when you saw me. Jerry was abstracted and queer all the way to the house and had a bruise on her head, and she keeps talking of the Tramp House and Peterkin who, she says, dealt the blow. I went to the Tramp House and found the old table on the floor with 3 of the legs on it. The 4th I couldn't find. I thought at first that the old wretch had quarreled with her about you on account of the suit, and she had squared up to him and he had struck her, but now I believe he had the diamonds, and she got them from him in some way, and he struck her with the missing table leg. If you say so, I'll have him arrested." Tom had told his story rapidly while Harold listened, until he suggested the arrest of Peterkin, when he exclaimed, "No, no, Tom. No. Don't you see, that would mix Jerry's name up with the diamonds, and that must not be. She must not be mentioned in connection with them until she speaks for herself. And besides, I do not believe it was Peterkin who took them. It might have been your Uncle Arthur." "Uncle Arthur?" Tom said indignantly. "Why, he gave them to Mother." "I know he did," Harold continued, "but in a crazy fit he might have taken them away and secreted them and then forgotten it, and Jerry might have known it and not been able to find them till now. Many things go to prove that." And very briefly Harold repeated some incidents connected with Jerry's illness when she was a child. "That looks like it, certainly," Tom said. "But I am awfully loath to give up arresting the brute, and believe I shall do it yet for assault and battery. He certainly struck her. You will see for yourself the lump on her head." So saying, Tom arose to go away, but before he went he made a remark quite characteristic of him and his feeling for Harold, to whom he said with a laugh, "Don't for thunder's sake think us a kind of Damon and Pythias twins, because I've joined hands with you against Peterkin and for Jerry. Herod and Pilate, you know, became friends, but I guess at heart they were Pilate and Herod still. No danger of my presuming at all upon your friendship for myself, though I thank you for your interest in Jerry," Harold replied. Then the two separated, Tom going his way and Harold his, until it was time for the afternoon train which was to take them home. The suit had gone against Peterkin, and it was in a towering rage that he stood in the depot, denouncing everybody, and swearing he would sell out Lubertu and every dumb thing he owned in Shannondale and take his money away, and then see how they'd get along without his capital to boost 'em. At Harold he would not even look, for his testimony had been the most damaging of all, and he frowned savagely when on entering the car he saw his son in the same seat with him, talking in low, earnest tones, while Harold was evidently listening to him with interest. The suit had been a pain and trouble to Billy from beginning to end, for he knew his father was in the wrong and he bore no malice toward Harold for his part in it, and when the diamonds came up and his father was clamoring for a writ, he was the first to declare Harold's innocence and to say he would go his bail. Now there was in his mind another plan by which to benefit his friend and rival too, for Billy knew he was that. And the heart of the little man ached with a bitter pain and sense of loss whenever he thought of Jerry, and lived over again the scene under the butternut tree by the river, when her blue eyes had smiled so kindly upon him and her hands had touched his, even while she was breaking his heart. When Billy reached his majority his father had given him $100,000, and thus he had business of his own to transact, and a part of this was just now centered in Washington Territory, where in Tacoma on Puget Sound he owned real estate and had dealings with several parties. To attend to this an agent was needed for a while, and he said to himself, "I'll offer it to Hal, with such a salary that he cannot refuse it. That will get him out of the way until this thing blows over." Billy knew perfectly well that although everybody said Harold was innocent and that 9/10 believed it, there would still be a few in Shannondale whose opinions his father's money controlled, who, without exactly saying they doubted him, would make it unpleasant for him in many ways, and from this he would save him by sending him to Tacoma at once, and thus getting him out of the way of any unpleasantness which might arise from his father's persecutions or those of his clan. It was this which he was proposing to Harold, who at once thought favorably of it, not because he wished to escape from the public, he said, but because of the pay offered, and which seemed to him far more than his services would be worth. "You are a noble fellow, Billy," he said. "I'll think of the plan and let you know after I've seen Jerry and Judge St. Clair." All right. He'll advise you to go," Billy said as they arose to leave the car, followed by Peterkin, who had been engaged in a fierce altercation with Tom, that young man having accused him of striking Jerry, and threatening to have him arrested for assault and battery the moment they reached Shannondale.
"Thunder and lightning and guns!" old Peterkin exclaimed, while the spittle flew from his mouth like the spray from Niagara. "I assault and batter Jerry Crawford? A gal? What do you take me for, young man? I'm a gentleman, I be, if I ain't a Tracy, and I never salted nor battered nobody, and she'll tell you so herself. Heavens and earth! This is the way 'twas." And Peterkin shook from his head to his feet, for, like most men who clamor so loudly for the law, he had a mortal terror of it for himself, and Tom's threatening looks and words made him afraid. "This is how 'twas. I found her in the Tramp House, and I was all fired mad at her about something, I shan't tell what, for Bill would kill me. But I pitched into her right and left, and by gum she pitched into me, so that for a spell it was nip and tuck betwixt us, and by George if she didn't order me out of the Tramp House and said it was hern, and I'll be dummed if I don't believe she'd have put me out too, body and bones. She was just like a tiger, and I swan I was feared on her and backed out with a kind of flourish of my fist on that darned old rotten table which went all to smash. And that's all I know. You don't call that salt and batter, do you?" Tom could not say that he did, but he replied, "That's your version of it. Jerry may have another, and her friends ain't going to have her abused by a chap like you, and my advice is that you hold your tongue both about her and Harold. It will be better for you, Do you understand?" "You bet," Peterkin said with a meaning nod, breathing a little more freely as he caught sight of the highest tower of Lumbertoo, and more freely still when he arrived at the station, where he was met by his coat-of-arms carriage instead of a writ, and was suffered to go peaceably home, a disappointed, if not a better man. End of chapter 42. Chapters 43 through 45 of Gretchen by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. Harold and Jerry. The news which so electrified all Shannondale was slow in reaching Mrs. Crawford, but it did reach her at last, crushing and overwhelming her with a sense of shame and anguish until, as the day wore on, Grace Atherton and Mrs. St. Clair and Nina and many others came to reassure her, and to say that it was all a mistake which would soon be cleared up. Thus comforted and consoled, she tried to be calm and wait patiently for the train. But there was a great pity for her boy in her heart as she sat by Jerry's bedside and watched her in all her varying moods, now perfectly quiet, while her wide-open eyes stared up at the ceiling as if she were seeing something there, now talking of Peterkin, and the Tramp House, and the table, and the blow, and again of the bag which she said was lost, and which her grandmother must find. Thinking she meant the carpet-bag, Mrs. Crawford brought that to her, but she tossed it aside impatiently, saying, "No, no, the other one, which tells it all. Where is it? I must have lost it. Find it, find it. To be so near and yet so far. What did it say? Why can't I think? Am I like Mr. Arthur? Crazy like him?" Mrs. Crawford thought her crazier than Arthur, and waited still more impatiently for Harold, until she heard his step outside and knew that he had come. "Harold!" "Grandma," was all they said for a moment, while the poor old lady was sobbing on his neck, and then he comforted her as best he could, telling her that it was all over now, that no one but Peterkin had accused him, that everybody was ready to defend him, and that after a little he could explain everything. "And now I must see Jerry," he continued, starting for the stairs, and glad that his grandmother did not attempt to follow him. Jerry had heard his voice, and had raised herself in bed, and as he came in met him with the question, "Have you brought them? Has anyone seen them?" The strange light in her eyes should have told Harold how utterly incapable she was of giving any rational answers to his questions, but he did not think of that, and instead of trying to quiet her, he plunged at once into the subject she had broached. "Do you mean the diamonds?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, the diamonds, where are they?" "Mrs. Tracy has them by this time," Harold replied. "Mrs. Tracy?" Jerry exclaimed. "What has she to do with them? They are not hers. They are mine. They are mine. Bring them to me. Bring them to me." She was terribly excited, and for a time Harold bent all his energies to soothe her, and at last, when from sheer exhaustion she became quiet, he said to her, "Jerry, where did you find the diamonds?" She looked at him curiously, but made no reply, and he went on. "You must tell me where you found them. It is necessary I should know." Still she did not reply, and he continued, "Those diamonds have caused me a great deal of trouble, and will cause me more unless you tell me where you found them. Try and think. Was it in the Tramp House?" That started her at once, and she began to rave of the Tramp House, and the rat hole, and the table, and Peterkin, who dealt the blow. The bruise on her head had not proved so serious as was at first feared, and with her tangled hair falling over her face Harold had not noticed it. But he looked at it now and questioned her about it, asking if Peterkin struck her there. "No," she said, and began again to babble of rat holes and table legs and bags and diamonds, until Harold was convinced that there was nothing to be learned from her in her present condition, and started for the Tramp House to see what that would tell him. The table was still upon the floor with the 3 legs upon it, while the 4th one was missing. But Harold found it at last, for remembering what Jerry had said of the rat hole, he investigated that spot, and from its enlarged appearance drew his own conclusion. Jerry had found the diamonds there, he had no doubt of it, and he said so to Tom Tracy, who appeared in the doorway just as he was leaving it. Sitting down upon the bench inside, the 2 young men, who had been enemies all their lives, but who were now drawn together by a common sympathy and love for Jerry, talked the matter over again, each arriving at the same theory as the most probable one they could accept.
Arthur, in a crazy fit, had secreted the diamonds, and Jerry knew it, though possibly not where he had put them. This accounted for her strange sickness when a child, while her finding them later on, added to other causes, would account for her sickness now.
Peterkin owns that he was blowing her up for something and that he knocked the table down with his fist, but he swears he didn't touch her," Tom said, repeating in substance all Peterkin had said to him in the train when shaking with fear of a writ. "And do you still mean to keep silent with regard to Jerry?" he asked.
"Yes," Harold replied. "Her name must not be mentioned in connection with the diamonds. I can't have the slightest breath of suspicion touching Jerry, my sister."
"Sister be hanged,"
Tom began savagely, then checked himself, and added with a laugh.
"Don't try to deceive me, Hal, with your sister business. You love Jerry and she loves you, and that is one reason why I hate you, or shall, when this miserable business is cleared up. Just now we must pull together and find out where she found the diamonds, and who put them there. To write to Uncle Arthur would do no good, though seeing him might. The last we heard he was thinking of taking the coast voyage from San Francisco to Tacoma."
"Tom," Harold exclaimed with great energy, as he sprang to his feet, "that decides me." And then he told of the offer Billy had made him on the car. "When I saw how sick Jerry was, I made up my mind not to accept it, although I need the money badly. But now if she gets no worse, I shall start for Tacoma in a few days, and shall find your Uncle Arthur, if he is to be found." It was growing dark when the two young men finally emerged from the house and stood for a moment outside, while Harold inquired for Maud.
"She is not very well, that's a fact," Tom said gloomily, "and no wonder when Mother keeps her cooped up in one room without enough fresh air, and lets nobody see her except the family and the doctor for fear they will excite her. She knows nothing about the diamonds or that Jerry is sick. I did tell her, though, that you had come home, and by Jove, I pretty near forgot it. She wants to see you bad. But, Lord, Mother won't let you in. No use to try. She's like a she-wolf guarding its cub. Good night."
And Tom walked away, while Harold went back to the cottage, where he found Jerry sleeping very quietly, with a look on her face so like that it had worn in her babyhood, when he called her his little girl, that he involuntarily stooped down and kissed it as one would kiss a beautiful baby. The next morning Jerry was very restless and wild, and Harold began to doubt as to whether he ought to take the western trip or not. If he went he must go at once, and to leave Jerry in her present state seemed impossible. He would consult the physician first, and Judge St. Clair next. The doctor gave as his opinion that Jerry was in no danger if she were only kept quiet. She had taken a severe cold and overtaxed her strength, but he had no fear for the result, and he thought Harold might venture to leave her.
"Yes, I'd go if I were you,"
he added, for, like Billy, he too thought it might be pleasanter for Harold to be out of the way for a time, although he did not say so. And this was the view the judge took of it, after a few moments' conversation. His first question had been, "Well, my boy, can you tell me now who gave them to you?" "No, I can't," was Harold's reply, and then, acting upon a sudden impulse, he burst out impetuously, "Yes, I will, for I can trust you, and I want your advice so badly." So he repeated rapidly all he knew, and his theory with regard to Arthur, whom he wished to find, and of Billy's proposition that he should go on his business to Tacoma. For a few moments the judge seemed perplexed and undecided. If Harold stayed, he might have some unpleasant things to bear and hear, for there were those who would talk in spite of their protestations of his innocence, while to go might look like running away from the storm, with the matter unexplained. On the whole, however, he thought it was better to go. "Jerry's interests are safe with me," he said, "and by the time you return everything will be explained. But find Mr. Tracy as soon as possible. I am inclined to think your theory with regard to him correct." So it was decided that Harold should go, and the next night was appointed for him to start. Had he known that Peterkin and even Mrs. Tracy were each in her own and his own way insinuating that he was running from public opinion, nothing could have induced him to leave. But he did not know it, and went about his preparations with as brave a heart as he could command under the circumstances. Jerry was more quiet now, though every effort on his part to learn anything from her concerning the diamonds brought on a fit of raving, when she would insist that the jewels were hers and must be brought to her. "But you told me they were Mrs. Tracy's," he said to her once. And she replied, "So they are, or were,
But oh, how little you know."
And this was all he could get from her. He told her he was going away, but that did not affect her, and she began to talk of Maud, who she said must not be harmed. "Have you seen her?" she asked him. "Not yet," he replied, "but I am going to say good-bye," and on the day of his departure he went to the Park house and asked if he could see Maud. "Of course not," was Mrs. Tracy's prompt reply when the request was taken to her. "No one sees her, and I certainly shall not allow him to enter her room." "But Dolly," Frank began protestingly, but was cut short by the lady, who said,
"You needn't dolly me or try to take his part either. I have my opinion, and always shall. He cannot see Maud, and you may tell him so,"
now turning to the servant who had brought Harold's message, and who softened it as much as possible. Harold had half expected a refusal, and was prepared for it. Taking a card from his pocket, he wrote upon it, "Dear Maud, I am going away for a few weeks, and am very sorry that I cannot see you, but your mother knows best, of course, and I must not do anything to make you worse. I shall think of you very often, and hope to find you much better when I return. Harold." "Will you give this to her?" he said to the girl, who answered that she would, and who took it to her young mistress late in the afternoon while the family were at dinner and she was left in charge of the invalid.
"Mr. Hastings sent you this," she said, handing the card to Maud, into whose face the bright colour rushed, but left it instantly as she read the few hurried lines. "Going away, gone, and I didn't see him," she exclaimed, regardless of consequences. "And mother did it, I know she did. I will talk," she continued, as the frightened girl tried to stop her, and then ran for Mrs. Tracy, who came in much alarm, asking what was the matter. "You sent Harold away. You didn't let him see me, and he is—" Maud gasped, but could get no farther, for the paroxysm of coughing which came on, together with a hemorrhage which made her so weak that they thought her dying all night, she lay so white and still and insensible, save at times when her lips moved, and her mother heard her whisper, "Send for Harold." Chapter 44. Jerry clears Harold. The next day 2 items of news went like wildfire through the little town of Shannondale. The first, set afloat by Peterkin and helped on by Mrs. Tracy, that Harold had run away from public opinion, which was fast turning against him, since he could not explain where he found the diamonds; and the second, that both Maud Tracy and Jerry Crawford were much worse, which made Harold's sudden departure all the more heinous in the eyes of his enemies. For what but conscious guilt could have prompted him to leave his sister, who, it was said, was calling for him with every breath, and charging him with having taken the diamonds? This was false, for although Jerry's fever had increased rapidly during the night, and her babbling was something terrible to hear, there was in it no accusation of Harold, although she was constantly talking to him, and asking for the diamonds and the bag. "It is a pity he ever told her about them," the doctor said, as twice each day, for 4 successive days, he came and looked upon her fever-stained cheeks, and counted her rapid pulse, and took her temperature, and listened to her strange talk, and then with a shake of his head drove over to Tracy Park, and stood by poor little Maud's couch, and looked into her death-white face, and counted her faint heartbeats, and tried in vain to find some word of encouragement for the stricken man, who looked about as much like death as the young girl so dear to him. And every morning, on his way from the cottage to Tracy Park, the doctor saw under the pines 2 young men, Tom and Dick, seated upon the iron bench, each whittling a bit of pine, which one was unconsciously fashioning into a cross, and the other into a gravestone. Tom had found Dick there working at his cross, and after a simple good morning, had sat down beside him and whittled in silence upon another bit of wood until the doctor appeared, on his way to Tracy Park. Then the whittling ceased, and both young men arose, and going forward, asked how Jerry was. "Pretty bad. Hal oughtn't to have gone, though I told him there was no danger. We must telegraph if she gets worse," was the reply as the doctor rode on. Then Tom and Dick separated, and saw no more of each other until the next morning, when they went again, and whittled in silence under the pines until the doctor came in sight, when the same question was asked and answered as on the previous day. Billy never joined them, but sat for hours and hours under the butternut tree where Jerry had refused him, watching the sluggish river, and wondering what the world would be to him if Jerry were not in it.
Had Billy been with Tom and Dick, he would not have whittled as they did, for all the nerve power had left his hands, which lay helplessly in his lap, and when he walked he looked more like a withered old man than a young one of 27. Maud was the first to rally. Her first question for Harold, her second for Jerry, and her father, who was with her, answered truthfully that Harold had not returned, and that Jerry was sick and could not come to her. He did not say how sick, and Maud felt no alarm, and waited patiently as the days went by, and Jerry did not appear, but grew worse so fast that the whole town was moved with sympathy for and interest in her. Jerry was a general favorite, and flowers and fruits and delicacies of every kind were sent to the cottage. Carriage after carriage stopped before the door, offer after offer of assistance was made to Mrs. Crawford, while Nina and Marian Raymond were there constantly. And Billy went to Springfield for a chair in which to wheel his sister to the cottage, for she could not yet mount into the dog-cart. And Tom and Dick whittled on until the cross and the gravestone were finished, and with a sickly smile Tom said to Dick, "Would you cut Jerry's name upon it?" "No. Oh, no," Dick answered with a gasp. "She may be better tomorrow." And when the crisis was past, and Jerry's strong constitution triumphed over the disease which had grappled with it, the village wore a holiday air as the people said to each other gladly, "Jerry is better. Jerry will live." Her recovery was rapid, and within a week after she awoke to perfect consciousness she was able to sit up a part of every day, and had walked across the floor and read a letter from Harold, full of solicitude for herself and enthusiasm for his trip over the wild mountains and across the vast plains to the lovely little city of Tacoma, built upon a cliff and looking seaward over the Sound. "Dear Harold," Jerry whispered, "I shall be so glad when he comes home. Nothing can be done till then. I am so bewildered when I try to think." In her weak state everything seemed unreal to Jerry, except the fact that she had found her mother, and many times each day she thanked her God who had brought her this unspeakable joy, and asked that she might do right when the time came to act. She knew the bag was safe, for she found it just where she had put it. But where were the diamonds? Had Harold taken them with him? Had he told anyone? Did his grandmother know anything about them, she wondered, and she tried in many ways to draw Mrs. Crawford out, but was unsuccessful, for there was now too much pain and bitterness connected with the diamonds for Mrs. Crawford to speak to her of them. But the poisonous breath of gossip had been at work ever since Harold went away, quietly aided and abetted by Mrs. Tracy, and openly pushed on by Peterkin, until Tom Tracy went to him one day and threatened to have him tarred and feathered and ridden on a rail if he ever breathed Harold's name again in connection with the diamonds. "Well, I swow," was all Peterkin said, as he put an enormous quid of tobacco in his mouth and walked away, thinking to himself, "'Twould take an all-fired while to scrape them tar and feathers off me, I'm so big, and I believe the feller meant it. Them high bucks wouldn't like no better fun than to make a spectacle of me. So I guess I'll dry up a spell." But the trouble did not stop with Peterkin's talk, for a neighboring Sunday paper, which fed its readers with all the choicest bits of gossip, came out with an article headed, "The Tracy Diamonds," and after narrating the story in a most garbled and sensational manner, went on to comment upon the young man's having run away rather than face public opinion, and to comment also upon the law which could not touch him because the offense was committed so long ago. One after another, and without either knowing that the other had done so, Tom and Dick and Billy waited upon the editor of the Sunday News, threatening to sue him for libel if he did not retract every word of the offensive article in his next issue, which he did. But the mischief was done, and the paper found its way at last to Jerry, sent unwittingly by Ann Eliza, who covered it over a basket of fruit and flowers which was carried one afternoon to the cottage. Jerry had been downstairs several times and had walked a little way in the lane, but was in her room when the basket was brought to her. Raising the paper, she was about to throw it on the floor, when her eye caught the words, "The Tracy Diamonds," and with bloodless lips and wildly beating heart she read the article through, understanding the situation perfectly and resolving at once how to act. It seemed to her that she was lifted above and out of herself, she felt so strong and light and well, as she put on her bonnet and shawl, and taking the leather bag in her hand, hurried downstairs in quest of Mrs. Crawford. "Grandma," she exclaimed, "why haven't you told me about Harold and the suspicion resting on him, and why did you let him go until I was better, and what are the people saying? Tell me everything." Jerry would not be put off, and Mrs. Crawford told her everything she knew, and that she herself had added to the mystery by the strange things she had said in her delirium about the diamonds, which she insisted were hers. "And they are mine," Jerry said, while Mrs. Crawford looked at her in alarm, lest her madness had returned. "Where are you going?" she gasped, as Jerry turned toward the door. "To Tracy Park, to claim my own and clear Harold," was the reply. "When I come back I will tell you all, but now I can't wait." "But, Jerry, you are not strong enough to walk there, and besides, they have company this afternoon, some kind of a new-fangled card party, and you must not go," Mrs. Crawford said. "I have the strength of 20 horses," Jerry replied, "and if they have company so much the better, for there will be more to hear my story. Goodbye." She was off like an arrow, and went almost upon a run through the woods until the house was reached, and then she stopped a moment to take breath and look about her. How fair and beautiful was everything, and Jerry's heart beat so hard that she felt for a moment as if she were choking to death, as she sat under a maple tree and tried to think it all over to make sure there was no mistake. Opening the box, she took out 2 papers and read them again as she had the night she was taken sick. One was a certificate of marriage, the other of a birth and baptism. There was no mistake. Holding the papers in one hand and the bag in the other, she went on to the house, from which shouts of laughter were issuing, Nina's voice and Marion's and Tom's and Dick's and Mrs. Tracy's. She could hear that distinctly, and she shuddered a little at the sound, for it brought back to her mind all the slights she had received from that woman who was so cruel to Harold, and the pity which had been springing up in her heart ever since she looked at the windows of Maud's room and thought of the white-faced girl lying there, died out, and it was more a nemesis than a gentle, forgiving woman who walked boldly into the hall and stood in the drawing-room door. Mrs. Tracy was having a progressive euchre party that afternoon. A friend in Boston had written her about it, and proud to be the first to introduce it in Shannondale, she stood flushed and triumphant, with the restored diamonds in her ears and at her throat, laughing merrily at Judge St. Clair, who had won the booby prize, a little drum as something he could beat, and who looked as if he did not quite see the joke. Apart from the rest, Frank Tracy sat looking on, though with no apparent interest in the matter. He had joined in the game because his wife told him he must, and had borne meekly her sarcastic remarks when he trumped her ace and ordered up on nothing. His thoughts were not with the cards, but upstairs with Maud, who seemed to be better, and for whom there was constantly a prayer in his heart. "Spare her, and I will make reparation. I will tell the truth." He was trying to bribe the Lord to hear him when he saw Jerry in the door, tall, thin, and white from her recent sickness, with eyes which rolled and shone and flashed as Arthur's did sometimes, and which fell at last upon Mrs. Tracy, where they rested with an intensity which must have drawn that lady's notice to her, if Frank had not exclaimed as he rose to his feet, "Jerry, how did you get here?" Then all turned and looked at her, and crowded around her with exclamations of surprise and wonder. For a moment Jerry stood like one in catalepsy, with no power to move or speak, but when Mrs. Tracy came forward and in her iciest tones said to her, "Good afternoon, Miss Crawford. To what am I indebted for this unexpected pleasure?" Her faculties came back, her tongue was loosened, and she replied in a clear voice, which rang through the room like a bell, and was indeed the knell to all the lady's greatness. "I am here to claim my own, and to clear Harold from the foul suspicion heaped upon him. I have seen the paper, have heard the whole from Grandma, and am here to defend him. It was I who gave him the diamonds. It was for me he kept silent, and let you think what you would." "You gave him the diamonds?" Mrs. Tracy repeated. "You gave him the diamonds, and have come to confess yourself a—" She never finished the sentence, for something in Jerry's face frightened her, while her husband, who had come forward, laid his hand warningly upon her arm. So absorbed were they all that no one saw the little girl who at the sound of Jerry's voice had, in her eagerness to see her, crept down the stairs and now stood in the doorway opposite to Jerry, her large bright eyes looking in wonder upon the scene, and her ears listening intently to what was as new to her as it had been to Jerry an hour ago. "Don't give me the name you have more than once given to Harold," Jerry said, as with a gesture she silenced Mrs. Tracy. "The diamonds are mine, not yours. Can one steal his own?" "Yours? Your diamonds? What do you mean?" Mrs. Tracy asked. "They were my mother's," Jerry replied, and she sent them to me." They all thought her crazy except Frank, to whom there had come a horrid presentiment of the truth, and who clutched his wife's arm hard as she said in a mocking, aggravating tone, "And your mother was?" Then Jerry stepped into the room and stood in their midst like a queen among her subjects as she answered, "My mother was Marguerite Heinrich of Wiesbaden, better known to you as Gretchen. And my father is Arthur Tracy, and I am their lawful child. It is so written here." And she held up the papers and the bag. "I am Jerry Tracy." Chapter 45. What followed.
"Thank God that it is out. I couldn't have borne it much longer,"
came involuntarily from Frank's lips. But no one heard it, for with one bound, as it seemed to the petrified spectators, who divided right and left to let her pass, Jerry reached the opposite doorway, and stooping over the little figure lying there so still, lifted it tenderly, and carrying it upstairs, laid it down in the room it would never leave again until other hands than hers carried it out and laid it away in the Tracy lot, where only Jack and the dark woman were lying now. Maud had heard all Jerry was saying and understood it, too, and at the words, "I am Jerry Tracy," she felt an electric thrill pass over her, like what she had experienced when watching the acting in some great tragedy. Then all was darkness, and she knew no more until Jerry was bending over her and she heard her mother saying, "Leave her to me, Miss Crawford. You have done harm enough for one day. You have killed my daughter." "No," Maud cried, exerting all her strength. "She has not hurt me. She must not go. I want her. For if what she said is true, she is my own cousin. Oh, Jerry, I am so glad." And throwing her arms around Jerry's neck, Maud sobbed convulsively, and clung tightly to Jerry, who, nearly distraught herself, did not know what to do. She knew that Mrs. Tracy looked upon her as an intruder, and possibly a liar, but she cared little for that lady's opinion. She only thought of Frank and what he would say. Lifting up her head at last from the pillow where she had lain it for a moment, she saw him standing at the foot of the bed, taller, straighter than she had seen him in years, with a look on his face which she knew was not adverse to herself. "Jerry," he said slowly and thickly, for something choked his speech, "I can't tell you now all I feel, only I am glad for you and Arthur, but gladder for myself." What did he mean, Jerry wondered, while Maud's eyes sought his questioningly, and his wife said sharply, "You are talking like a lunatic. Do you propose to give up so easily to a girl's bare word? Let Jerry prove it before she is mistress here." Then Maud whispered, "There were papers in your hand, Jerry, and you said, 'It is so written here.' Bring the papers and read them to us. I can bear it. I must hear them. I must know."
"Better let her have her way," Frank said, and Dolly could have knocked him down, he spoke so cheerfully, while Jerry answered,
"I can't read them myself aloud. I couldn't bear it." "But Marian can. She understands German. Let them all come up. They will all have to know," Maud persisted. After a moment during which a powerful tonic had been given to his daughter, Frank went down to his guests, who were eagerly discussing the strange story which not one of them doubted in the least. In her haste to reach Maud, Jerry had dropped the bag and the two papers, which Judge St. Clair picked up and held for a moment in his hand. Then passing the papers to Marian, he said, "It can be no secret now, and Jerry will not care. What do the papers contain?" Running her eyes rapidly over them, Marian said, "The first is a certificate of marriage between Arthur Tracy and Marguerite Heinrich, who were married October 20th, 1800 in the English Church of Wiesbaden, by the Reverend Mr. Eaton, then the officiating clergyman. The second is a certificate of the birth and baptism of Gérine, daughter of Arthur and Marguerite Tracy, who was born at Wiesbaden, January 1st, 1800 and christened January 8th, 1800 by the Reverend Mr. Eaton." Then a deep silence fell upon the group, while Tom stood like one paralyzed. He understood the situation perfectly, and knew that Jerry was mistress of Tracy Park. "May as well vacate at once," he said at last, with an attempt to smile, as he walked slowly out of the house. Just then Frank came down, saying that Maud insisted upon knowing what was in the papers which Marian was to read, while the others were to come up and listen. He did not seem at all like a man who had lost anything, but bustled about cheerily, and when the judge said to him apologetically, "We know the contents of 2 of the papers. They are certificates of the marriage of Arthur with Gretchen and of Jerry's birth. I hope you don't mind if we read them," he answered briskly. "Not at all, not in the least. Arthur and Gretchen. I thought so. Where is Tom? He must hear the papers." He found his son sitting under the tree where he had been sitting the morning when Jerry came near fainting there, and in his hand was a bit of wood finished like a gravestone, the same he had whittled under the pines and on which he was now carving, "Euchred, August , 1800 " "This is the monument to our downfall," he said as his father came up to him with something so pitiful in his face and voice that Frank gave way suddenly, and sitting down beside him, laid his hand upon his tall son's head and cried for a moment like a child, while Tom's chin quivered, and he was mortally afraid there was something like tears in his own eyes, and he meant to be so brave and not show that he was hurt. "I am sorry for you, my boy," Frank said at last, "but glad for Jerry. So glad. And she will not be hard upon us. I shall ask no favors of her. I can stand it if you can, though money is a good thing to have." And then, without in the least knowing why, he thought of Ann Eliza, and wondered how her ankle was getting along, and if he ought not to have called upon her again. "Marian is going to read the papers in Maud's room, and I have come for you," Frank said. "I don't care to hear them," Tom replied. "I am satisfied that we are beggars and Jerry the heiress." But Frank insisted, and Tom went with him to his sister's room, followed by their friends, for whom the dinner was waiting and spoiling in the kitchen, where as yet no hint of what was transpiring had reached, save the fact that Maud had been downstairs and fainted. She was propped upon pillows, and her eyes were fixed upon Jerry, who sat by her side holding her hands, which she occasionally kissed and caressed. "Where did you find the bag?" the judge asked. And then Jerry narrated the particulars of her interview with Peterkin, whose destruction of the table had resulted in her finding the bag with the diamonds in it. "They were mother's," she said, the last word almost a sob, as she turned her eyes upon Mrs. Tracy, who stood like a block of stone, with no sympathy or credulity upon her face. "Father bought them for her at the same time with Mrs. Tracy's, which they are exactly alike. It is so written in her letter. And she sent them for me. They are mine, and I gave them to Harold to keep until I could think what to do. The diamonds are mine." She was still looking at Mrs. Tracy, on whom all eyes were resting as the precious stones flashed and glittered and shone in the sunlight. For an instant the proud woman hesitated, then quickly unclasping the earrings and the pin, she laid them in Jerry's lap. "You are welcome to your property if it is yours, I am sure," she said, and was about to leave the room. But her husband kept her back. "No, Dolly," he said. "You must stay and hear and know. It concerns us all." As he had closed the door and stood against it, she had no alternative except to stay, but she walked to the window and stood with her back to them all, while Marian put into English and read that message from the dead. End of chapters 43, 44, and 45. Chapters 46 and 47 of Gretchen by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. The Letters. There were 4 of them. 2 in Arthur's handwriting, 1 directed to Mrs. Arthur Tracy, Wiesbaden, postmarked Liverpool, 1 to Marguerite Heinrich, Wiesbaden, postmarked Shannondale, 1 in a strange handwriting to Arthur Tracy, if living, and 1 to Arthur Tracy's friends, if he were dead or incapable of understanding it. And it was this last which Marian read, for as Arthur was living, she felt that with his letters strangers had nothing to do. The letter to the friends, which had evidently been written at intervals as the writer's strength would permit, was as follows. Wiesbaden, December , 1800 . To the friends of Mr. Arthur Tracy, if he is dead, or incapable of understanding this letter from his wife who was Marguerite Heinrich, and whom he always called Gretchen. I want to tell you about it for the sake of my little Jerry whom, if her father is dead, I give to your care, praying God to deal with you as you are good and just to her. And I want you to forgive my husband, and not be angry with him for marrying me, a poor obscure girl with neither money nor name. I was 17 when I first saw Mr. Tracy. My father was dead, I was an only child, and my mother kept a little fancy shop in Wiesbaden. I went to school and learned what other girls like me learned, to read and write and knit and sew and fear God and keep His commandments. People called me pretty. I don't know that I was, but he told me so when he came to me one day as I was knitting under a tree in the park. He had a picture made of me as I was then, and it is on the wall, but I have pawned it for the rent, as I have almost everything." "Oh, Jerry!" Marian exclaimed at this point. But Jerry's face was buried in Maud's pillow, and she made no response, so Marian went on. "He came many times, for I was always there waiting for him, I am afraid. But when he said he loved me and wanted me for his wife, I could not believe it. He was so grand, so like nobility, and I so poor and plain. Then mother died suddenly. Well today, dead tomorrow, with cholera, and I was left alone. 'Gretchen, we must be married now,' he said to me, the night after the funeral, and I answered him, 'Yes, we must be married.' And we were the next day in the little English church by Mr. Eaton the pastor. You will find the certificate with the other papers. Do you ever remember a beautiful moonlight night when the air was soft and warm, and sweet with many summer flowers, and there was music in the distance, and heaven seemed so near that you could almost touch the blue lining which separates it from us? Well, just like that was my life with Arthur for a few months. Oh, how I loved him, and how he loved me! It frightened me sometimes, he was so fierce and—I don't know what the word is— so something in his love. He never left me a moment. He couldn't, he said, for I was his balance wheel, and without me he was lost. I think now he was crazy then. I know he was afterward, when he did such queer things, and forgot so often, sometimes the house we lived in, sometimes his own name, and at last me, his Gretchen. That was so sad, when he went away, and stayed away for weeks and said he had forgotten. But he was sorry, too, and made it up, and for 10 days heaven came down again so I could touch it. Then he went away, and I have never seen him since. You must excuse me, his friends, if I stopped a little while to cry. It makes me so lonesome to think of the long years, 4 and more, which have been buried with the yesterdays, under the flowers and under the snow, since Arthur went away and left me all alone. If I had told him, he might have come back, he was so fond of children. But I was not sure, and I would not tell a lie, and let him go without a hint. I wrote him once I had something to tell him when he came which would make him glad as it did me, and he never replied to it, though he wrote 2 or 3 times more, and sent me money, but did not tell where he was, only he was being cured, he said. That was all. In January my baby was born, and I had her christened Gerine by Mr. Eaton. You will find it with the papers. Then how I longed for him, and waited and watched. But he never came, and I knew he had forgotten, but I did not doubt his love for a moment, or that he would one day come back, and I tried to improve myself and learn what was in books so I could mate with him better when he came home, which he never did, and the years went on, and my little Jerry grew more lovely every day. She is standing by me now and says, "Are you writing to him?" Darling Jerry, you will be kind to her, won't you, for his sake, and for me too, who will be dead when you read this? Jerry was sobbing now, and Maud's arm was around her neck while Frank had walked to a window, and, like his wife, was looking out upon the lawn which he did not see for the tears which filled his eyes. "When the money stopped," the letter went on, "we grew so poor, Jerry and I and Nanine, that is the Frenchwoman who lives with me and whom Jerry calls Mani. She will bring my child to you when I am dead, and oh, be kind to her, for a truer, more faithful woman never lived. She is such a comfort to me, except when she scolds about Arthur and calls him a bête noire, which he is not, as you will see. He was shut up, I don't know where, but think it was where they put people with bad heads, and he forgot everything till he was out, and as far as Paris on his way to America. Then he remembered, and wrote me from Liverpool such a letter, full of love and sorrow for the past, and sent me such lovely diamonds, just like those he had bought for his sister in America, he said. And he was going home at such a date on the Scotia, and he wished me to join him in Liverpool. I send the letter with this to prove that I write true. But it was too late, for I was too weak to travel. Neither could I write to him in America, for he gave me no address. That was last September, and I have been dying ever since, for my heart broke when I thought of what was and what might have been, could I have found him. The money he sent me then I am saving for Nanine and Jerry to take them to America when I am dead. All the days and nights I prayed that Arthur might remember and write me again, and God heard, and he did, and 5 days ago I received his letter. So crazy it was, but just as full of love and tenderness and a desire to see me. He told me of his lovely home and the Gretchen room, where my picture is in the window, and in case there should be no one to meet me at the station when I arrived, he sent me directions how to find Tracy Park, and told me just what to do when I reached New York. He would come for me himself, he said, only the sea made him so sick, and he was afraid he should forget everything if he did. But you will see in his letter what he wrote and how fond he was of me, and if he is alive and too crazy to understand now, tell him, when he is better, how I loved him, and prayed for him every hour that God would bring him at last where I am going so soon. Nanine will take him my Bible with passages marked by me and a photograph which I had taken a year ago, and which will tell you how I looked then. Now I am so thin and pale that Arthur would hardly know me. I send, too, a lock of Jerry's hair, cut when she was 3 weeks old. She is such a comfort to me, and so old and womanly for her years. She will remember much of our life here, for she notices everything and understands it too, and goes over as in a play what she sees and hears. We have been cold and hungry sometimes, but not often, the neighbors are so kind. And when I am dead they will see that Nanine is made ready for America with Jerry and the papers and the diamonds, which I might have pawned when our need was greatest, but I could not. I must save them for Jerry, and may she wear them many days in years to come, when her mother is dust and ashes in the ground, but a glorified spirit in paradise, where I shall watch over her, and, if I can, be with her often, and keep myself in her mind, so that she will never forget my face or the old home in Germany. God bless my little daughter, and make her a true noble woman, and God bless you, Arthur's friends, who read this, and incline you to be kind and just to Jerry, and see that she has her own. For there must be money at Tracy Park, and if you are poor and Jerry comes rich, tell her from her mother to be kind to you, and give as you have given to her. Now I must stop. I am so tired, and it is growing so dark that Nanine has opened the stove door to let the light fall on the paper in my lap, and Jerry is standing by me and says, "Are you going to God pretty soon?" "Yes, darling, very soon. Tonight, perhaps, or tomorrow, or when he will. The air grows cold, the night is coming on, my eyes are dim, my head is tired. I think, yes, I think it will be tomorrow. Goodbye. Gretchen Tracy." As she finished reading, Marian arose, and going up to Jerry, kissed her lovingly, and said to her in German, "That was your mother's picture in our old home in Wiesbaden. I am so glad for you." A low sob was Jerry's reply, and then Judge St. Clair asked, "Is that all?" "Yes," Marian said, "all except Mr. Tracy's letters to Gretchen. Oh no," she added, "there is something more." And feeling in the bag she drew out 2 small papers, one crumpled and worn, as if it had often been referred to, the other folded neatly and tied with a white ribbon. This Marian opened first, and found it to be a certificate, written in English, to the effect that Mrs. Arthur Tracy, née Marguerite Heinrich, died at such a date and was buried by the Reverend Dr. Bellows, the resident rector of the English Church. The other was in Arthur's handwriting, and the directions he had written to his wife as to what she was to do and how to find Tracy Park. "Yes," Judge St. Clair said, coming forward and taking the paper from her hand. "This is what the station master saw the poor woman examining that night in the storm. She probably dropped it into the bag without stopping to fold it. There can be no doubt." Then a deep silence reigned for a moment in the room, until Mrs. Tracy, who all through the reading had stood like a block of granite by the window, turned and walking up to Jerry said, in a bitter tone, "Of course there is no mistake. I do not doubt that you are mistress here, and am ready to leave at once. Shall we pack up and quit tonight?" "Dolly, mother!" came angrily and sternly from both Tom and Frank, and "Oh, mamma, please," came faintly from Maude, while Jerry lifted up her head and looking steadily at the cruel woman said, "Why are you so hard with me? I cannot help it. I am not to blame. I mean to do right. Only wait a little. I am so sick now, so dizzy and blind. Will somebody lead me out where I can breathe? I am choking here." It was Tom who took her into the open air, and to a seat under the tree where once before she had almost fainted as she did now, with her head upon his shoulder, for he put it there, and then pushed her hair back from her face as he said lightly, "Don't take it so hard. If we can stand it, you can." Then Jerry straightened up and said, "Tom, do you want to kill me now?" "What do you mean?" he asked, and she replied, "Don't you know you said under the pines that you would kill any claimant to Tracy Park who might appear against you?" "I remember it," Tom said, "but I didn't think then that the claimant would be you," and he put his arm around her as he continued, "I can't say that I am not awfully cut up to be turned neck and heels out of what I believed would be my own. But if I must be, I am glad it is you who do it, for I know you'll not be hard upon us, or let Uncle Arthur be, even if Mother is so mean. Remember, Jerry, that I loved you and asked you to be my wife when I believed you poor and unknown." Tom was very politic, but all the good there was in him seemed now to be on the surface, and while inwardly rebelling at his misfortune, he felt a thrill of joy in knowing that Jerry was his cousin, and would not be hard upon him. "Shall we go back to the house?" he said at last, and they went back, meeting the people upon the piazza, where they stopped for a moment while Jerry's hands were shaken, and she was congratulated that at last the mystery was cleared and her rights restored to her. "Mr. Arthur Tracy ought to be here," Judge St. Clair said. "Yes, I thought of that," Tom replied, "and shall telegraph him tomorrow." Then they said good night, and without going in to see either Mr. or Mrs. Tracy again, Tom and Jerry walked toward the cottage through the woods, where the trees met in graceful arches overhead, and the moonlight fell in silver flecks upon the grass, and the summer air was odorous and sweet with the smell of the pines and the balm of Gilead trees scattered here and there. It was a lovely place, and Tom thought so with a keen sense of pain as after leaving Jerry at her gate he walked slowly back, until he reached the 4 Pines, where he sat down to think and wonder what he should do as a poor man, with neither business or prospects. "I don't suppose father has laid up much," he said, "for since Uncle Arthur came home he has done very little business, and has spent what really was his own recklessly and without a thought of saving, he was so sure to have enough at last, and Uncle Arthur was so free to give us what we asked for. But that will end when he knows he has a daughter, and as he never fancied me much, I shall either have to beg or work or starve or marry a rich wife, which is not so easy for a poor dog to do. I don't suppose that governor's daughter would look at me now, nor anyone else who is anybody. By George, I ought to have called on Aunt Eliza again. I wonder if it's too late. I believe I'll walk around there anyway, and if I see a light I'll go in, and if old pater familias, how I'd like to kick him, is there, I'll tell him the news, and that I know now he did not strike Jerry with the table leg, and perhaps I'll apologize for what I said in the car. Tom Tracy, you are a scoundrel, and no mistake," he added with energy as he arose and struck into the field through which he had dragged Aunt Eliza the night of the storm. There were lights at Le Bateau, and Tom was soon shaking hands with old pater familias and with Aunt Eliza, who was now able to come downstairs. Chapter 47. Arthur. He had enjoyed himself immensely from the moment he first caught sight of grand old Pike's Peak on the distant plains until he entered the city of the Golden Gate, and standing on the terrace of the Cliff House, looked out upon the blue Pacific with the sea lions disporting on the rocks below. For he went there first, and then to Chinatown, and explored every nook and corner and opium den in it, and drank tea at $20 a pound in a high-toned restaurant, and visited the theatre and the Joss House, and patronized the push-cars, as he called them, every day, and experienced a wonderful exhilaration of spirits as he sat upon the front seat, with the fresh air blowing upon his face, and only the broad, steep street lined with palaces before him. "This is heaven. This clears the cobwebs," he said to Charles, who sat beside him with chattering teeth and his coat collar pulled high about his ears, for the winds of San Francisco are cold even in the summer. Arthur's first trip was to the Yosemite, taking the Milton route and meeting with the adventure he so much desired, for in the early morning between Chinese camp and priests the stage was suddenly stopped by 2 masked marauders, one of whom stood at the horses' heads, while the other confronted the terrified passengers with the blood-curdling words, "Hands up, every soul of you." and the hands went up from timid women and strong men until click-click came in rapid succession from the driver's box where Arthur sat, and shot after shot followed each other, one bullet grazing the ear of the highwayman at the horses' heads, and another cutting through the slouched hat of his comrade near the stage. "Leave, or I'll shoot you dead. I've 5 more shots in this one, and 2 more revolvers in my pockets, and I'm not afraid," Arthur yelled, jumping about like a maniac, and so startling the robbers that they fled precipitately, followed for a little distance by Arthur, who had leaped from the stage and who started in pursuit with a revolver in each hand and ball after ball flying ahead of him as he ran. When at last he came back, the passengers flocked around him, grasping his hands and blessing him as the preserver of their money if not of their lives. After that Arthur was a lion whom all the people in the valley wished to see and talk with, and with whom the landlord bore as he had never borne with a guest before, for Arthur found fault with the rooms which he likened to bathtubs, and fault with the smells which came from the river, and fault with the smoke in the parlor, but made ample amends by the money he spent so lavishly, the scores of photographs he bought, and the puffs he wrote for the San Francisco papers, extolling the valley as the very gate of heaven, and the hotel as second only to the palace, and signing himself Bumblebees. He went on every trail, and climbed the highest possible peak, and when he stood on the top of Old Capitan and looked down upon the world below, he capered and shouted like a madman, singing at the top of his voice, "Mine eyes have seen the coming of the glory of the Lord, glory, glory, alleluia," until the rocky gorges rang with the wild echoes which went floating down the valley below, where the sun was shining so brightly and the grass was growing so green. On his return to San Francisco, after an absence of several weeks, he took up his abode at the Palace Hotel, which he turned topsy-turvy with his vagaries, but the landlord could afford to bear much from one who spent his money so freely, and so he was allowed to change rooms every day if he liked, and half the plumbers in the city were called in to see what caused the smells which he declared worse than anything he had ever met in his life, and which were caused in part by the disinfectants which he bought by the wholesale and kept in his bathroom, his washroom, and under his bed, until the chambermaid tied up her nose in camphor when she went in to do her work. But his career was brought to a close suddenly one morning, when just as he was taking his coffee and rolls in his room, Charles brought him the following telegram. "Come immediately. There's the devil to pay. Tom Tracy." Arthur read the message 2 or 3 times, not at all disturbed by it, but vastly amused at its wording. Then, putting it down, he went on with his breakfast until it was finished, when he took a card from his pocket and wrote upon it, "Pay him then, for I shan't come. Arthur Tracy." This was handed to Charles with instructions to forward it to Tracy Park. This done, he gave no further thought to the message so full of such import to himself, but began to talk of and plan his contemplated trip to Tacoma by the next steamer which sailed. It was 6 o'clock when he had his dinner in his own private parlor, where he was served by both Charles and a waiter, and where a second telegram was brought him. "Confound it," he said, "have they nothing to do at home but to torment me with telegrams? Didn't I tell them to pay the old Harry and done with it? What do they mean?" And putting the envelope down by his plate, he went quietly on with his dinner until he was through, when he took it up, and breaking the seal, read, "Come at once, I need you. Jerry." That changed everything, and with a bound he was in the next room, gesticulating fiercely, and ordering Charles to step lively, and get everything in readiness to start home on the first eastward-bound train which left San Francisco. "That rascally Tom is a liar," he said. "It's not the devil to pay, it's Jerry. Do you hear? It's Jerry. Bring me some paper, quick, and don't stand staring at me as if I were a lunatic. It's Jerry who needs me." Charles brought the paper, on which his master wrote, "Coming on the wings of the wind. Yours respectfully, Arthur Tracy." In less than half an hour this singular message was flying along the wires across the continent, and within a few hours Arthur was following it as fast as the steam horse could take him. End of chapters 46 and 47. Chapter 48 of Gretchen by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 48. What they were doing and had done in Shannondale. If the earth had opened suddenly, and swallowed up half the inhabitants of Shannondale, The other half could not have been more astonished than they were at the news which Peterkin was the first to tell them, and which he had risen very early to do, before someone else should be before him. Irascible and quick-tempered as he was easily appeased, and the fact that Jerry was Arthur Tracy's daughter changed his opinion of her at once.
"The biggest heiress in the county except my Ann Liza, and by gum I'm glad on't for her and Arthur. I allus said she was his'n, and by George, to think I helped her into her fortune, for if I hadn't of knocked that rotten old table down she'd have never found them memoirs," he said to the first person to whom he communicated the news, and then hurried off to enlighten others, until everybody knew and was discussing the strange story. Before noon, scores of people had found it in their way to walk past the cottage hoping to catch sight of Jerry, while a few went in to tell her how glad they were for her and Mr. Arthur. But Jerry was in her room, too sick and tired to see them, and they could only question Mrs. Crawford, who was herself half crazed. When Mrs. Crawford heard the story Jerry told her after her return from the Park House, she had been for a few moments stupefied with amazement, and had sat motionless until she heard Jerry say to her, "Dear Grandma, I told you your working days were over, and they are, for what is mine is yours and Harold's, and my home is your home always, so long as you live." Then the poor old lady put her head upon Jerry's arm and cried hysterically for a moment, then she rallied and kissed the young girl who had been so much to her, and whom for a brief moment she feared she might have lost. For a long time they talked of the past and the future, and of Harold, who was in Tacoma, where he might have to remain for 3 or 4 weeks longer. He had written several times to his grandmother and once to Jerry, but had made no mention of the diamonds, while in her letters to him Mrs. Crawford had refrained from telling him what some of the people were saying, and the construction they were putting upon his absence. Jerry had not yet written to him, but, "I shall tomorrow," she said, "and tell him to come home, for I need him now, if ever." Jerry was very tired when she went at last to bed, but the dreamless sleep which came upon her, and which lasted until a late hour in the morning, did her good, and probably saved her from a relapse which might have proved fatal. Still she was very weak and too sick to go downstairs, for the excitement of the previous night was telling upon her, and when Tom came asking to see her she received him in her room. He had been up since sunrise, strolling through the park with a troubled look on his face, for he was extremely sorry for himself, though very glad for Jerry, whose sworn ally he was and would be to the end. In a way he had tried to comfort his mother by telling her that neither his uncle or Jerry would be unjust to her if she'd only behave herself, and treat the latter as she ought, and not keep up such a high and mighty and injured air, as if Jerry had done something wrong in finding out who she was. But Dolly would not be comforted, and her face wore a sullen, defiant expression, as she moved about the house where she had queened it so long that she really looked upon it as her own, resenting bitterly the thought that another was to be mistress there. She had talked with her husband, and made him tell her exactly how much he was worth in his own right, and when he told her how little it was, she had exclaimed angrily, "We are beggars, and may as well go back to Langley and sell codfish again." She had seen Tom that morning, and when to her question, "Why are you up so early?" he replied, "To attend to Jerry's affairs," she tossed her head scornfully and said, "Before I'd crawl after any girl, much less Jerry Crawford. You'd better be attending to your own sister. She's worse this morning, and looks as if she might die at any minute." Then Tom went to Maud, who, since the shock of the night before, had lain as if she were dead, except for her eyes, in which there was a new and wondrous light, and which looked up lovingly at Tom as he came in and kissed her, a most unusual thing for him to do. "Dear Tom," she whispered, "come closer to me," and as he bent down to her she continued, "Is everything Jerry's?" "Yes, or will be. She is Uncle Arthur's daughter." "Shall we be very poor?" "Yes. Poor as a church mouse." Then there was a pause, and when Maud spoke again she said slowly, "For me, no matter. Sorry for you, and father and mother, but glad for Jerry. Stand by her, Tom. Tell mother not to be so bitter. It hurts me. Tell Harold when he comes I meant to do so much for him, but Jerry will do it instead. Tell her I must see her, and send for Uncle Arthur." There was a lump in Tom's throat as he left his sister's room, and going to the village, telegraphed to his uncle's headquarters at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco.
At least 100 people stopped him on his way to the office, asking if what they heard was true, and to all he replied, "True as the gospel. We are floored, as Peterkin would say." And then he hurried to the cottage to see Jerry and tell her of the message sent to Arthur, though not how it was worded. After a moment he continued, hesitatingly, as if half ashamed of it. "I called at Le Berthoud last night to inquire after Annalisa's foot, and you ought to have seen Peterkin when I told him the news. At first he could not find any word in his vocabulary big enough to swear by, but after a while one came to him, and what do you think it was?" Jerry could not guess, and Tom continued. "He said, 'By the great Peterkin,' and then he swowed and vowed and snummed and vummed and dummed, and finally said he was glad of it, and had always known you were a Tracy. Annalisa was so glad she cried. And I think Billy cried too, for he left the room suddenly with very suspicious-looking eyes. Why, everybody is glad for you, Jerry, and nobody seems to think how mean it is for us. But I'm not going to whine. I'm glad it's you, and so is Maude, and she wants to see you. I believe she's going to die, and, Jerry—" Something choked Tom for a moment, and then he went on. "If Uncle Arthur should get high and order us out at once, as father seems to think he will, you'll let us stay while Maude lives, won't you?" "Tom," Jerry said reproachfully, "what do you take me for, and why does your father think his brother will order him out?" "I don't know," Tom replied, "but he seems awfully afraid to meet him. Mother says he was up all night walking the floor and talking to himself, and yet he says he is glad, and he is coming this morning to see you and talk it over. I believe I hear him now speaking to Mrs. Crawford. Yes, 'tis he. So I guess I'll go, and when I hear from my telegram I'll let you know. Goodbye." A moment after Tom left the room his father entered it, looking haggard and old, and frightened too, it seemed to Jerry, as she met him with a cheery, "Good morning, Uncle Frank." It was the first time she had addressed him by that name, and her smile was so bright and her manner so cordial that for an instant the cloud lifted from his face, but soon came back darker than ever as he declined the seat she offered him and stood trembling before her. Frank had not slept the previous night, but had walked his room until his wife said to him angrily, "I thought you were glad. Seems to me you don't act like it. But for pity's sake stop walking, or go somewhere else to do it and not keep me awake." Then he went into the hall outside, and there he walked the livelong night, trying to think what he should say to Jerry, and wondering what she would say to him, for he meant to tell her everything. Nothing could prevent his doing that, and as soon as he thought she would see him he started for the cottage, taking with him the Bible, the photograph, and the letter he had secreted so long. All the way there he was repeating to himself the form of speech with which he should commence, but when Jerry said to him so graciously, "Good morning, Uncle Frank," the words left him, and he began impetuously, "Don't call me uncle. Don't speak to me, Jerry, until you have heard what I have come to confess, on my knees, with my white head upon the floor, if you will it so, and that would not half express the shame and remorse with which I stand before you, and tell you I am a cheat, a liar, a villain, and I have been since the day when I first saw you and that dead woman we thought your mother." Jerry was dumb with surprise, and did not speak or move as he went on rapidly telling her the whole, with no attempt at an excuse for himself, except so far as to repeat what he had done in a business point of view, making provision for her in case of his death, and enjoining it upon his children to see that his wishes were carried out. "Here is the Bible," he said, laying the book in her lap. "Here is the photograph, and here the letter which you gave me to post, and which, had it been sent, might have cleared the mystery sooner." He had made his confession, and he stood before her with clasped hands and an expression upon his face such as a criminal might wear when awaiting the jury's decision. But Jerry neither looked at him nor spoke, for through a rain of tears she was gazing upon the sweet face, sadder and thinner than the face of Gretchen in the window, but so like it that there could be no mistaking it, and so like to the face which had haunted her so often and seemed so near to her. "Mother, mother, I remember you as you are here, sick and sorry, but oh, so lovely," she said as she pressed her lips again and again to the picture, with no thought or care for the wretched man who had come a step nearer to her, and who said at last, "Will you never speak to me, Jerry?
Never tell me how much you despise me." Then she looked up at the face quivering with anguish and entreaty, and the sight melted her at once. Indeed, as he had talked, she had scarcely felt any resentment toward him, for she was sure that though his error had been great, his contrition and remorse had been greater, and she thought of him only as Maud's father and the man who had always been kind to her. And she made him believe at last that she forgave him for Maud's sake, if not for his own. "Had my life been a wretched one because of your conduct," she said, "I might have found it harder to forgive you, but it has not. I have not been the daughter of Tracy Park, it is true, but I have been the petted child of the cottage, and I would rather have lived with Harold in poverty all these years than to have been rich without him. And do you know, I think it was noble in you to tell me when you might have kept it to yourself." "No, no, I couldn't have done that much longer," he exclaimed energetically, as he began to walk up and down the room. "I could not bear it. And the shadow which for years has been with me night and day, counseling me for bad, was growing so black and huge and unendurable, that I must have confessed or died. But it is gone now, or will be when I have told my brother." "Told your brother? You don't mean to do that?" Jerry exclaimed. "But I do mean to do it," Frank replied, "as a part of my punishment, and he will not forgive as you have done. He will turn me out at once, as he ought to." Jerry thought this very likely, and with all her powers she strove to dissuade Frank from making a confession which could do no possible good, and might result in untold harm. "Remember Maud," she said, "and the effect this thing would have upon her if your brother should resort to immediate and violent means, as he might in his first frenzy." "But I mean to tell Maud, too," Frank replied. Then Jerry looked upon him as madder than Arthur himself, and talked so rapidly and argued so well that he consented at last to keep his own counsel, for the present at least, unless the shadow still haunted him, in which case he must tell as an act of contrition or penance. "He will think the photograph came with the other papers in the bag," Jerry said, as she again kissed the sweet face which looked so much like life that it was hard to think there was not real love and tenderness in the eyes which looked into hers so steadfastly. It was the hardest to forgive the letter hidden so long, and Jerry did feel a pang of resentment, or something like it, as she took it in her hand, and thought of the day when Arthur had confided it to her, saying he could trust her when he could not another. And she had trusted Frank, who had not been true to her trust, and here, after the lapse of years, was the letter, with its singular superscription, covering the whole side, and its seal unbroken. But she would break it now. She surely might do that, if Arthur was never to see it. And after a moment's hesitancy she opened it and read, first wild, crazy sentences, full of love and tenderness for the little Gretchen to whom they were addressed, and whom the writer sometimes spoke to as living and again as dead. There was a strong desire expressed to see her, a wish for her to come and get her diamonds before they were taken from her a second time. Here Jerry started with an exclamation of surprise, and involuntarily read aloud, "The most exquisite diamonds you ever saw, and I long to see them on you. They are safe, too, from her, Mrs. Frank Tracy, who had the boldness to flaunt them in my face at a party the other night. How she came by them I can't guess, but I know how she lost them. I found them on her dressing table when she left them when she went to breakfast, and took possession at once. That was no theft, for they are mine, or rather yours, and are waiting for you in my private drawer where no one has ever looked, except a young girl called Jerry, who interests me greatly. She is so much like what you must have been when a child. There has been some trouble about the diamonds. I hardly know what. My head is in such a buzzing most of the time that everything goes from me but you. Oh, if I had remembered you years ago, as I do now." Jerry could read no further, for the letter dropped from her hands as she cried joyfully, "I knew he had them, I was sure of it, though I did not know where they were." Then very briefly she explained to Frank that on the morning when the diamonds were missed, Arthur was so excited, because Harold had been in a way accused, that he had rambled off into German and said things which made her think he had taken them himself and secreted them. "You remember my sickness," she said, "and how strangely I talked of going to prison as an accessory or a substitute? Well, it was for your brother I was ready to go, and when he told me, as he did one day, that he knew nothing of the diamonds, I was never more astonished in my life. But afterwards, as I grew older, I believed that he had forgotten them as he did other things, and that sometime he would remember and make restitution. I am glad we know where they are, but we cannot get them until he returns. When do you think that will be?" Frank did not know. It would depend, he said, upon whether he was in San Francisco when Tom's telegram was received,
If he were and started at once, traveling day and night, he would be home in a week. It seemed a long time to wait in Jerry's state of mind, and very, very short to the repentant man, who shrank from his brother's return as from an impending evil, although it was a relief to think that he need not tell him what a hypocrite he had been. "Thank you, Jerry," he said at last, as he arose to go. "Thank you for being so kind to me. I did not deserve it. I did not expect it. Heaven bless you. I am glad for you, and so is Maud. Oh, Jerry, Heaven is dealing hard with me to take her from me, and yet it is just. I sinned for her. Sinned to see her in the place I was sure was yours, for I knew you were Arthur's child, and I meant to go to Germany some day, when I had the language a little better, and clear it up, and then I had promised myself to tell you. Will you say again that you forgive me before I go back to Maud?" He was standing before her with his white head dropped upon his hat, the very picture of misery and remorse, and Jerry laid her hand upon his head and said, "I do forgive you, Uncle Frank, fully and freely, for Maud's sake if for no other. And if she lives, what is mine shall be hers. Tell her so, and tell her I am coming to see her as soon as I am able. I am so tired and sick today, and everything is so strange. Oh, if Harold were here!" Jerry was indeed so tired and exhausted that for the remainder of the day she saw no one but Judge St. Clair and Tom, both of whom came up together, the latter bringing the answer to his telegram and asking what to do next. "Why, Tom," Jerry said as she read Arthur's reply, "pay him then, for I shan't come? What does he mean? What did you say to him, and whom are you to pay?" With a half-comical smile Tom replied, "I told him the old Nick was to pay, though I'm afraid I used a stronger name for his satanic majesty than that. I guess you'll have to try what you can do." And so Jerry's message, "I need you," went across the continent and brought the ready response, coming on the wings of the wind. It was Judge St. Clair who wrote to Harold for Jerry, who said, "Tell him everything, and how much I want him here, and tell him too of Maud, whose life hangs on a thread. That may bring him sooner." It was 3 days before Jerry was able to go to the Park House, and then Tom came for her, saying Maud was failing very fast. The news which had come upon her so suddenly with regard to Jerry's birth, and the suspicions resting upon Harold, shortened the life nearing its close, and the moment Jerry entered the room she knew the worst, and with a storm of sobs and tears knelt by the sick girl's couch and cried, "Oh, I can't bear it. I'd give up everything to save you. Oh, Maud, you don't know how much I love you." Maud was very calm, though her lips quivered a little, and the tears filled her eyes as she put her hand in Jerry's. A great change had come over Maud since the night when she heard Jerry's story, a change for the better some might have thought, although the physician who attended her gave no hope. She neither coughed nor suffered pain, and could talk all she liked, although often in a whisper, she was so very weak. "Yes, Jerry," she said, "I know you love me, and it makes me very glad, and dying seems easier, for I know you will be cared for. Once, when I first thought I must die, I wrote something on paper for Father and Uncle Arthur to see when I was dead, and it was that they should take you in my place, you and Harold." Maud's voice shook a little here, but she soon steadied it and went on. "I wanted them to give you what I thought would be mine had I lived, and what all the time was yours. Oh, Jerry, how can you help hating me, who have stood so long where you ought to have stood, and enjoyed what you ought to have enjoyed?" "Maud," Jerry cried, "don't talk like that. As if I, or anyone, could ever have hated you. Why, I worshipped you as some little empress when I used to see you in your bright sashes and yellow kid boots, with the amber beads around your neck. And if the contrast between your finery and my high-necked gingham apron and white sunbonnet sometimes struck me painfully, I had no wish to take the boots and sashes from you, whom they fitted so admirably. And as we grew older and you did not shrink from or slight Jerry Crawford, I cannot tell you how great was the love which grew in my heart for you, the dearest girlfriend I ever had, and 1,000 times dearer now I know you are my cousin." Maud was silent for a moment, and then she asked abruptly, "Jerry, why did you never fall in love with Harold?" "Oh, Maud!" And Jerry started as if Maud had struck her, while the telltale blood rushed to her face, and into her eyes there came a look which even Maud could understand. "Jerry," she exclaimed, "forgive me. I didn't know.
I never guessed. I was so stupid. But I have been thinking so much since Harold went away. Does he know about you? Who you are, I mean. And how long before he will come home?" "Judge St. Clair wrote him everything 3 days ago," Jerry replied, "and told him how sick you were. That will surely bring him at once if it is possible for him to leave. But it will be 3 or 4 days now before the letter will reach him, and it will take a week for him to come. Would you like to see him very much?" "Yes," Maud answered, "but I never shall. Jerry, did Harold does he love you?" "He never told me so," Jerry said frankly, "but I thought that he loved you." No," Maud answered piteously. "It was all a mistake, and when I am dead and Harold comes, promise to tell him something from me, will you?" "Yes," Jerry replied, and Maud continued. "Tell him, the very first time you and he are alone together, and speak of me, that I have been thinking and thinking until it came to me clear as day that it was all a mistake, a stupid blunder on my part. I was always stupid, you know, but I believe my brain is clearer now. Will you tell him, Jerry?" "Mistake about what?" Jerry asked, with a vague apprehension that the task imposed upon her might not be a pleasant one if she knew all it involved. "Harold will tell you what," Maud answered. "He will understand what I mean, but I shall not be here when he comes, I am sure of it. I hope to live till Uncle Arthur comes, for I must see him and ask him not to be too hard on poor father, and tell him I am sorry that I have been so long in the place where you should have been. You will stay here and be with me to the last. I want you to hold my hand when I say good-bye forever. You are so strong that I shall not be afraid with you to see and hear as long as I hear and see anything." "And are you afraid?" Jerry asked, and Maud replied. "Of the death struggle, yes. But not what lies beyond where he is, the Saviour, for I know I am going to him. And when they think me asleep, I am often praying silently for more faith and love, and for you all, that you may one day come where I soon shall be. Heaven is very, very beautiful, for I have seen it in my dreams. A material heaven, some would say, for there are trees and flowers and grass. And on a golden bench beneath a tree whose leaves are like emeralds and whose blossoms are like pearls, I am sitting on the bank of a shining river, resting and waiting, as little Pilgrim waited for the coming of the Master, and for you all." Maud was very tired, and her voice was so low that Jerry could scarcely hear it, while the eyelids drooped heavily, and in a few moments she fell asleep, with a rapt look on her face, as if she were already resting on the golden seat beneath the tree whose leaves were emeralds and whose blossoms were like pearls. That night Jerry wrote as follows: "Dear Harold, Maud is very low, and unless you come soon, you will never see her again. The judge has written you of me, but I must tell you myself that nothing can ever change me from the Jerry of old, and the fact which makes me the happiest is that now I can help you who have been so kind to me. How I long to see you and talk it all over. We expect Mr. Arthur in a few days. I cannot call him father yet, until he has himself given me the right to do so by calling me daughter first. But to myself I am calling Gretchen mother all the time, my darling little mother. Oh, Harold, you must come home and share my happiness, which will not be complete till you are here. Jerry." During the next few days Jerry stayed with Maud, waiting anxiously for tidings from Arthur, until one lovely September morning a telegram was brought to Frank from Charles which said they would be home that afternoon. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Gretchen by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 49. Telling Arthur. Who should do the telling was the question which for some time was discussed by Frank and Judge St. Clair and Jerry. Naturally the task fell upon the latter, who went over and over again in her mind what she should say and how she should commence. But when at last the announcement came that Arthur was in Albany, it seemed to her that she had suddenly turned into stone, for every thought and feeling left her, and she had no plan of action or speech as she moved mechanically about Arthur's rooms, making them bright with flowers, especially the Gretchen room, which was a bower of beauty when her skilful hands had finished it.
Slowly the day wore on, every minute seeming an hour, and every hour a day, until Jerry heard the carriage driving down the avenue, and not long after the whistle of the engine in the distance. Then, bending over Maud and kissing her fondly, she said, "Pray for me, darling. I am going to meet my father." Arthur had been very quiet during the first part of the journey from San Francisco, and it was with difficulty that Charles could get a word from him. "Let me alone," he said once when spoken to. "I am with Gretchen. She is on the train with me, and I'm trying to make out what it is she is telling me." But after Albany was left behind, his mood changed, and he became as wild and excitable as he had before been abstracted and silent, and when at last Shannondale was reached, he bounded from the car before the train stopped, and was collaring Rob, the coachman, and demanding of him what was the matter with Jerry and why he had been sent for. Rob, who had received his instructions to be wholly non-committal, answered stolidly that nothing was the matter with Jerry, but that Miss Maud was very sick and probably would not live many days. "Is that all?" Arthur said gloomily as he entered the carriage. "I don't see what the old Harry has to do with Maud's dying, and certainly Tom's telegram said something about that chap. I have it in my pocket. Yes, here it is. Come immediately, the devil is to pay. That doesn't mean Maud. There is something else Rob has not told me. Here, you rascal, you are keeping something from me. What is it? Out with it!" he shouted to the driver as he thrust his head from the carriage window where he kept it, and in this way was driven to the door of the Park house, where Frank was waiting for him outside, and where inside Jerry stood holding fast to the banisters of the stairs, her heart throbbing wildly one moment and the next seeming to lie pulseless as a piece of lead. She heard Arthur's voice as he came up the steps, speaking to Frank, and asking why he had been sent for. And the next moment she saw him entering the hall, tall and erect, but with the wild look in his eyes which she knew so well, but which changed at once to a softer expression as they fell upon her. "Jerry, you here!" he cried, as he sprang to her side and kissed her forehead and lips, while Jerry could scarcely restrain herself from falling upon his neck and sobbing out, "Oh, my father, I am your daughter, Jerry!" But the time for this had not come, and when he questioned her eagerly as to why she had sent for him, she only replied, "Maud is very sick. But come with me to your rooms, and I will tell you everything." "Then there is something to pay. I thought so," he said, as he followed her upstairs into the Gretchen room, where he stood for a moment amazed at the effect produced by the flowers and vines which Jerry had arranged so skillfully. "It is like Eden," he said, "and Gretchen is here with me. Darling Gretchen," he continued, as he walked up to the picture and kissed the lovely face which, it seemed to Jerry, smiled in benediction upon them both, as they stood there side by side, her hands resting on his shoulder, which she pressed hard, as if to steady herself, while he talked to the inanimate face before him. "Have you been lonesome, Gretchen, and are you glad to have me back again? Poor little Gretchen." And now he turned to Jerry and said, "It all came to me on the top of those mountains, about Gretchen. Who she was, and how I forgot her so long. That is the strangest of all. And, Jerry," here his voice dropped to a whisper, "I know for sure that Gretchen is dead. That came to me too." "Yes, Gretchen is dead," Jerry answered him, while her hands tightened their grasp on his shoulder as she went on. "I have had a message from her, and that is why we sent for you." Jerry's hands were not strong enough to hold him then, and wrenching himself from her, he stood confronting her with a look more like that of a maniac than any she had seen in him before, and which might have frightened one with nerves less strong than hers. But she was not afraid, and a strange calmness fell upon her, now that she had actually reached a point where she must act, and her eyes, which looked so steadily into Arthur's, held them fast, even while he interrogated her rapidly. "A message from Gretchen? Where is it? Give it to me quick, or tell me about it. Where is she, and when is she coming?" "Never," Jerry answered sadly. "I told you she was dead. But sit here," and she motioned him to a large armchair. "Sit here, and let me tell you what I know of Gretchen." Something in the girl's manner mastered him, and made him a child in her hands. Sinking into the chair, pale and panting with excitement, he leaned his head back wearily, and closing his eyes said to her, "Begin. What did Gretchen write?" Jerry felt that she could not stand through the interview, and bringing a low ottoman to Arthur's side, seated herself upon it just where she could look into his face and detect every change in it. "Let me tell you of Gretchen as she was when you first knew her," she said, "and then you will be better able to judge of the truth of all I know." He did not reply, and she went on. "Gretchen was very young, 16 or 17, when you first saw her knitting in the sunshine under the trees in Wiesbaden, and very beautiful too. So beautiful that you went again and again to look at her and talk to her, until you came to love her very much and told her so at last, but you seemed so much above her that she could not believe you at first. At last, however, you made her understand, and when her mother died suddenly—" "Her mother was Mrs. Heinrich, and kept a kind of fancy store," Arthur interposed, as if anxious that nothing should be omitted. "Yes, she kept a fancy store," Jerry rejoined, "and when she died suddenly and left Gretchen alone, you said to her, 'We must be married at once,' and you were, in the little English chapel by the Reverend Mr. Eaton, who was then rector." Here Arthur's eyes opened wide and fixed themselves wonderingly upon Jerry as he said, "Are you the old Harry that you know all this? But go on, don't stop. It all comes back to me so plain when I hear you tell it. She wore a straw bonnet trimmed with blue, and a white dress, but took it off directly for a black one because her mother was dead. Did she tell you that?" "No," Jerry replied. "She told me nothing of the dress, only how happy she was with you, whom she loved so much, and who loved her and made her so happy for a time that earth seemed like heaven to her, and then—" Here Jerry faltered a little, but Arthur's sharp "What then?" kept her up, and she continued, "Then something came to you, and you began to forget everything, even poor little Gretchen, and went away for weeks and left her very sad and lonely, not knowing where you were. And then, after some months, you went away and never came back again to the little wife who waited, and watched, and prayed, and wanted you so badly." "Oh, Cherry! Oh, Gretchen! I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do it. I surely didn't. May God forgive me for forgetting the little wife. Was it long? Was it months, or was it years? I can't remember, only that there was a Gretchen and I left her," Arthur said. "It was years, 4 or more, and—" Jerry's breath came heavily now, for she was nearing the point relating to herself, and wondering what the effect would be upon him. "After a while there came into Gretchen's life the dawning of a great hope, which she felt would make you glad, and wishing to keep it a secret till you came home, she only gave you a hint of it. She wrote, 'I have something to tell you, which will make you as happy as it does me.'" "Stop!" And Arthur put out both his hands as if groping for something which he could not find. Then he said, "Go on." And Jerry went on, slowly now, for every word was an effort, and spoken so low that Arthur bent forward to listen to her. "I don't know just where Gretchen's home was when she lived alone waiting for you. I only know that after a while there came to it a little baby. A girl baby, Gretchen's and yours." She did not get any further, for with a bound Arthur was on his feet, every faculty alert, every nerve strung to its utmost pitch, and every muscle of his face quivering with wild excitement as he exclaimed, "A baby! Gretchen's baby and mine! A little girl! Oh, Cherry, if you are deceiving me now—" Jerry too had risen, and was standing before him with her hands upon his arm and her eyes so like Gretchen's looking into his as she said, "I am not deceiving you. There was a baby born to you and Gretchen sometime in January 1800 —, and it was christened in the little church where you were married by the Reverend Mr. Eaton. Oh, Mr. Arthur, how can I tell you? The baby is living yet, grown to womanhood now, for this happened more than 20 years ago, and the girl is 20 now, and is waiting and longing so much for her father to recognize and claim her. Oh, don't you understand me? Look at me, and then at Gretchen's picture." For an instant Arthur stood like one stricken with paralysis, his eyes leaping from Jerry's face to Gretchen's, and from Gretchen's back to Jerry's, and then, with a motion of his hands as if fanning the air furiously, he gasped, 20 years ago! 20 years ago! How old are you, Cherry?" 20, she answered, but her voice was a whisper, and her head fell forward a little, though she kept her eyes upon Arthur, who went on, "And they christened my baby and Gretchen's, you say? What name did they give her? Speak quick, for I believe I am dying." "They called her Jerrine, but you know her as Jerry, for I am Gretchen's daughter," Jerry said. With a wild, glad cry, "My daughter! Oh, my daughter! Thank God! Thank God!" Arthur sank back into the chair, fainting and insensible. For hours he lay in a state so nearly resembling death that but for the physician's reassurance that there was no danger, Jerry would have believed the great joy given her was to be taken from her at once. But just as the twilight shadows began to gather in the room he came to himself, waking as from some quiet dream, and looking around him until his eyes fell upon Jerry sitting by his side. Then over his white face there came a look of ineffable joy and tenderness and love, as he said with a smile the most winning and sweet Jerry had ever seen, "My daughter, my little Cherry, who came to me up the ladder with Gretchen's eyes and Gretchen's voice, and I did not know her. I've not known her all these years, although she has so puzzled and bewildered me at times. My daughter, oh, my daughter." He accepted her unquestioningly, and Jerry threw herself into the arms he stretched toward her, and on her father's bosom gave vent to the feelings she had restrained so long, sobbing passionately as she felt Arthur's kisses upon her face and his caressing hands upon her hair as he kept repeating, "My daughter, Gretchen's baby and mine." "There is more to tell. I have not heard it all, or how you came by the information," he said, when Jerry was a little composed and could look at and speak to him without a burst of tears. "Yes, there is much more. There is a letter for you with those you wrote to her," Jerry said, "but you must not have them tonight. Tomorrow you will be stronger. Now you must rest." She spoke like one with authority, and he did just what she bade him to do, took the food she brought him, went to bed when she said he must go, and with her hand locked in his, fell into a heavy slumber which lasted all through the night and late into the next morning. It almost seemed as if he would never waken, the sleep was so like death, but the doctor who watched him carefully quieted Jerry's fears and told her it would do her father good, and that in all probability he would awake with a clearer mind than he had had in years, for as great and sudden shocks sometimes produced insanity, so contrariwise, it sometimes restored a shattered mind to its equilibrium. And the doctor was partially correct, for when at last Arthur awoke he seemed natural and bright, with a recollection of all which had happened the day before, and an earnest desire for the letters and the rest of the story, which Jerry told him, with her arm across his neck, and her cheek laid occasionally against his, as she read him the letter directed to his friends, and then showed him the certificate of her birth and her mother's death. "Born January 1st, 1800, to Arthur Tracy and Marguerite, his wife, a daughter," Arthur repeated again and again, and as often as he did so, he kissed the bright face which smiled at him through tears, but there was almost as much sadness as joy mingled with the reading of that message from the dead. Just what Gretchen's letter to Arthur contained Jerry never knew, except that it was full of love and tenderness, with no word of complaint for the neglect and forgetfulness which must have hastened her death. "Oh, Gretchen, I can't bear it, I can't," Arthur moaned, as he laid his hand upon Jerry's shoulder and sobbed like a child. "To think I could forget her, and she so sweet and good." Everything came back to him for a time, and he repeated to Jerry much which was of interest to her concerning her mother, but with which the reader has nothing to do; while Jerry in her turn told him all she could remember of her life in the old house where Gretchen had died. Then she asked him why he had never told them that she was his wife. "It might have helped to clear up the mystery with regard to Monty and myself," she said, and he replied, Yes, it might, and I don't know why I didn't. When we were first married I was going to write Frank about it, but Gretchen persuaded me not to. She had an idea that I was as much above her as a king is above his subjects, and that my friends would be very angry with me and perhaps win my love from her. I think this idea so strong with her must have found a place in my maddened brain, and kept me from telling who she was. I remember having a feeling that I must not tell until she came, when I knew her sweetness and beauty would disarm all prejudice there might exist against her. I was sane enough always to know that my wife would not be acceptable to either Frank or Dolly. But, oh, I wish I had told them the truth at once. Poor Gretchen, poor Gretchen. He began to pace the room rapidly and to beat the air with his hands, as he always did when roused and excited. But Jerry quieted him at last, and then gave him his own letters addressed to Gretchen. But at these he barely glanced, muttering as he did so, "How could I have written such crazy bosh as that?" And then, suddenly recollecting himself, he asked for the photograph mentioned in Gretchen's letter to his friends, and which he seemed to think had come with the other papers. Taking it from the bag, Jerry handed it to him, while his tears fell like rain as he gazed upon the face which was far too young to wear the sad, wan look it did. "That is as I remember her," Jerry said, referring again to the strange ideas which had filled her brain and made her sure that not the dark woman found dead at her side was her mother, but another and far different person, whose face haunted her so continually and whose voice she sometimes seemed to hear speaking to her from the dim shadows of the far-off past when they lived in the little house in Wiesbaden where the picture hung on the wall. Arthur remembered the picture well, and when it was taken, though that too had faded from his mind until Jerry told him of it. "We will go there together, Jerry," he said, "and find the house and the picture and Gretchen's grave, and bring them home with us. There is room for them at Tracy Park." He was beginning to talk wildly again, but Jerry succeeded in pacifying him, and taking up the box of diamonds, opened it suddenly and held it before his eyes. In reading the letters he had not seemed to pay any attention to the diamonds, but when Jerry said to him, "These were mother's. You sent them to her from England," he replied, "Yes, I remember. I bought them in Paris with other things, dresses, I think, for her," while into his face there came a troubled look as if he were trying to think of something. Jerry, who could read him so well, saw the look, and guessing at once its cause, hastened to say, "Father, do you remember that you gave Mrs. Tracy some diamonds like these, and that someone took them from her? Try and think," she continued, as she saw the troubled look deepen and the fire beginning to kindle in his eyes. "It was years ago, just after a party Mrs. Tracy gave, and at which she wore them. You were there and thought they were Gretchen's, did you not?" "Yes," he answered slowly. "I believe I did. What did I do with them? Do you know?" "I think you put them in your private drawer. Suppose you look and see." Obedient to her as a child, Arthur opened his private drawer, bringing out one thing after another, all mementos of the old Gretchen days, and finally the diamonds, at which he looked with wonder and fear as he said to Jerry, "Did I take them? Will they call it a steal? I thought they were Gretchen's. I remember now." Jerry did not tell him then of the trouble the secreting of the diamonds had brought to her and Harold, but she said, "No one will think it a steal, and Mrs. Tracy will be glad to get her jewels back. May I take them to her now?" "Take them to her? No," Arthur said decidedly. "She has another set. I bought them for her, and she wears them all day long." "Diamonds in the morning with a cotton gown," and he laughed immoderately at what he thought Dolly's bad taste. "Take them to her? No, they are yours." "But I have mother's," Jerry pleaded, "and I cannot wear two sets." "Yes, you can. One today, one tomorrow. I mean you shall have 7, one for every day in the week. What has Dolly to do with diamonds? They are for ladies, and she is only a whitewashed one." He was very much excited, and it took all Jerry's tact to soothe and quiet him. "Father," she began, and he stopped at once, for the sound of that name spoken by Jerry had a mighty power over him. "Father, listen to me a moment." And then she told him of the suspicions cast upon Harold, and said, "You do not wish him to suffer any more?" "Harold? The boy who found you in the carpet-bag, Amy's boy? No, never. Where is he that I have not seen him yet? Does he know you are my daughter?" Jerry had not mentioned Harold before, but she told her father now where he was, and why he had gone, and that she had written him to come home, on Maud's account if on no other. "Yes, Maud. I remember. But Harold did not care for Maud. Still, he had better come. I want him here with you and me, and you must stay here now, day and night. Select any room you please. All is yours, my daughter." "But I cannot leave Grandma," Jerry said. "Let her come too," Arthur replied. "There's room for her." "No," Jerry persisted, "that would not be best. Grandma could not live with Mrs. Tracy." "Then let Dolly go at once. I'll give the order now," and Arthur put out his hand to the bell cord. But Jerry stopped him instantly, saying to him, "Remember Maud. While she lives her mother must stay here." "Yes, I forgot Maud. I have not seen her yet," Arthur replied, subdued at once, and willing that Jerry should take the jewels to Dolly, who deserved but little forbearance from her. Up to the very last, Mrs. Tracy had, unconsciously perhaps, clung to a shadowy hope that Arthur might repudiate his daughter, and called it a trumped-up affair. But when she heard how joyfully he had acknowledged and claimed her, she lost all hope, and her face wore a gloomy expression when Jerry entered her room and told her in a few words that her own diamonds had been found, and where they had been secreted, and that she had come to return them. "Then your father was the thief," Dolly said, with that rasping, aggravating tone so hard to hear unmoved. "Call him what you please. A crazy man is not responsible for his acts," Jerry answered calmly as she walked from the room, leaving Dolly to her own morbid and angry thoughts. Not even the restored diamonds had power to conciliate her. "I'll never wear them because she has some like them," she said to herself. And then the thought came to her that she could sell them, and add to the sum which her husband had invested in his own name. "Yes, I'll do it," she continued, "but even that will hardly keep the wolf from the door, for Frank is growing more and more imbecile every day, and Tom is good for nothing. He'll have to scratch for himself, though, I can tell him." Here her very characteristic soliloquy was brought to an end by a faint call, which had the power to drive every other thought from her heart, for the mother love was strong even with her, and going to Maud, she asked what she wanted. "Uncle Arthur," Maud replied. "I have not seen him yet. And Jerry, too. She has scarcely been here today." Maud's request was made known to Arthur, who 2 or 3 hours later went to her room, and told her how sorry he was to find her so sick, and that he hoped she would soon be better. Frank was with Maud, sitting upon the side of her bed, near the head, with his arm across her pillow, and his eyes fixed anxiously upon her as she held her conference with his brother. "No, uncle," she said, "I shall never be any better in this world, but pretty soon I shall be well in the other. And I want to tell you how glad I am for you and Jerry, and to thank you for your kindness to us all these years, when Jerry should have been here in our place." "Yes, yes," Arthur said with a wave of his hand, "only I didn't know. If I had—" "It would have been so different," Maud interrupted him. "I know that, but I want you to be kind to poor father still, and forgive him, he is so sorry, and—" "Oh, Maud, Maud!" came like a groan from Frank as he laid his hand on Maud's lips, while Arthur replied, "Forgive him for what? He couldn't help being here. I sent for him. He did not keep Jerry from her rightful position as my daughter. If he had, I could never forgive him. Why, I believe I'd kill him, or any other who, knowing that Jerry was my daughter, kept it from me." He was gesticulating with both hands, and Jerry, who had come in with him, took hold of them as they were swaying in the air, and said to him softly, "Father." The word quieted him, and with a gasp his mood seemed to change at once. "Maud is very tired," Jerry went on. "Perhaps we'd better go now, and come again tomorrow." "Yes, yes, that's best, child. I'm not fond of sick rooms, though I must say this is very free from smells," Arthur replied. Then stooping down he kissed Maud, and said to her as he arose to go, "Don't worry about your father. He is my brother, and he was kind to Jerry. I shan't forget that. Come, my daughter." And putting his arm around Jerry, he left the room. End of chapter 49. Chapters 50 and 51 of Gretchen by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 50. The Flower Fadeth. It was some days after Arthur's return before the household settled down into anything like order and quiet, for Arthur was so restless and so happy, and so anxious for everyone to recognize Jerry as his daughter. Miss Tracy, he called her when presenting her to the people who had known her all her life, the St. Clairs and the Athertons, the Crosbys and Warners, who came to call upon and congratulate him. Even Peterkin came with a card as big as the back of Webster's spelling book, and himself gotten up in a dress coat with lavender kids on his burly hands, which nearly crushed Arthur's, as he expressed himself, "tickleder than he ever was before in his life." "And to think I was the means on't," he said, "for if I hadn't of kicked that darned old table into slivers when I was giving on't to Jerry, she'd never have knowed what was in that dummed rat hole. I was a little too obstropolous, I s'pose, but I'll be darned if she didn't square up to me like a catamount till my hair riz right up, and I concluded the Tramp House was no place for me. But I respect her for it,
Yes, I do, and by George, old chap, I congratulate you with my whole soul, and so does May Jane, and so does Ann Lizzie, and so does Bill, and so does the whole caboodle on us."
This was Peterkin's speech, which Arthur received more graciously than Jerry, who, remembering Harold, could not be very polite to the man who had injured him so deeply. As if divining her thoughts, Peterkin turned to her and said, "Now, one word, Miss Tracy, about Hal. I ain't one to go halves in anything, and I was meaner to him than pussly. But you'll see what I'll do. I've met with a change. I swow I have." And he laid his lavender kid on his stomach. "He never took them diamonds, nor May Jane's pin, nor nothin'. And I've blasted it all over town that he didn't, and I've got a carriage hired, and some chaps, and a brass band, and a procession, and when Hal comes, there's to be an oblation to the depot, with the bugle a-playin' Hail to the Chief, and them hired chaps a-hissin' him inter the carriage, with the Star-Spangled Banner a-floatin' over it, and a-drawin' him home without horses. What do you think of that for high?" And he chuckled merrily, as he repeated the program he had prepared for Harold's reception. Jerry shuddered, mentally hoping that Harold's coming might be at night and unheralded, so as to save him from what she knew would fill him with disgust. That call of Peterkin's was the last of a congratulatory nature made at Tracy Park for weeks, for the shadow of death had entered the grand old house, the doors and windows of which stood wide open one lovely September morning about a week after Arthur's return. But there was no stir or sign of life except in the upper hall near the door, and in the room where Maud Tracy was dying. Jerry had been with her constantly for 2 or 3 days, and the conversation the two held together would never be forgotten. Maud was very peaceful and happy and sure of the home beyond, where she was going, and very lovely and sweet to those around her, thinking of everything, and planning everything, even whose hands were to lower her into the grave. "Dick and Fred and Billy and Harold," she said to Jerry one day. "Something tells me Harold will be here in time for that, and if he is, I want those 4 to put me in the grave. They can lift me, for I shall not be very heavy," and with a smile she held up her wasted arms and hands not as large now as a child's. "And Jerry," she went on, "I want the grave lined with boughs from our old playing place, the 4 pines, you know, and many flowers, for I shudder at the thought of the cold earth which would chill me in my coffin. So heap the grave with flowers, and come often to it, and think lovingly of me lying there alone. I am thinking so much of that poem Harold read to me long ago of poor little Alice, the May Queen, who said she should hear them as they passed, with their feet above her in the long and silent grass. Maybe the dead can't do that, I don't know, but if they can, I shall listen for you, and be glad when you are near me, and I know I shall wait on the golden seat by the river. Remember your promise to tell Harold that it was all a mistake. My mind gets clearer toward the end, and I see things differently from what I did once, and I know how I blundered. You will tell him?" Again Jerry made the promise with a sinking heart, not knowing to what it bound her, and as Maud was becoming tired she bade her to try to rest while she sat by and watched her. The next day, at the same hour, when the balmy September air was everywhere, and the mid-afternoon sun was filling the house with golden light, and the cricket's chirp was heard in the long grass, and the robins were singing in the tree-tops, another scene was presented in the sick room, where Frank Tracy knelt at his dying daughter's side, with his face bowed in his hands, while her fingers played feebly with his white hair as she spoke to Arthur, who had just come in. They had told him she was dying, and had asked for him. And with his nervous horror of everything painful and exciting he had shrunk from the ordeal. But Jerry's will prevailed, and he went with her to the room where Frank and his wife and Tom were waiting. Tom standing with folded arms at the foot of the bed, and looking with hot, dry eyes into the face on the pillow where death was setting his seal, the mother half fainting upon the lounge with the nurse beside her, and Frank oblivious of everything except the fact that Maud was dying. "Kiss me good-bye, Uncle Arthur," she said when he came in, "and come this side, where father is." Then as he went round and stood by Frank, she reached her hand for his, and putting it on her father's head, said to him, "Forgive him, Uncle Arthur. He is so sorry, poor father, the dearest, the best man in the world. It was for me. Say that you forgive him." Only Frank and one other knew just what she meant, although a sudden suspicion darted through Jerry's mind, and when Arthur looked helplessly at her she whispered to him, "Never mind what she means, her mind may be wandering, But say that you forgive him, no matter what it is." Thus adjured, Arthur said to the grief-stricken man, who shook like an aspen, "I know of nothing to forgive, except your old disbelief in Gretchen, and deceiving me about sending the carriage the night Jerry came. But if there is anything else, no matter what it is, I do forgive you freely."
"Thanks," came faintly from Maud, who whispered, "Remember, it is a vow made at my deathbed."
She had done all she could, this little girl, whose life had been so short, and who, as she once said, had been capable of nothing but loving and being loved, and now, turning her dim eyes upon Jerry, she went on,
"Remember the promise, and the flowers, and the golden seat where you will find me resting by the river whose shores I am now looking upon, for I am almost there, almost to the golden seat, and the tree whose leaves are like emeralds, and where the grass and flowers are like the flowers and grass of summer just after a rain. I am glad for you, Jerry. Good-bye. And you, dear father, good-bye."
That was the last, for Maud was dead, and the servants who had been standing about the door stole noiselessly back to their work, with wet eyes and a sense of pain and loss in their hearts, for not one of them but had loved the gentle girl now gone forever from their midst. It was Jerry who led Frank from the room to his own, where she left him by himself, knowing it would be better so, and it was Arthur who took Dolly out, for Tom had disappeared, and no one saw him again until the next day, when he came down to breakfast, with a worn, haggard look upon his face which told that he did care, though his mother thought he did not, and taunted him with his indifference. He had gone directly to his room and locked the door, and smoked and thought, and then, when it was dark, he had stolen out into the park as far as the 4 Pines, and smoked, and looked up at the stars, and wondered if Maud were there with Jack, sitting on the golden seat by the river. Then, going back to the house when no one saw him, he went into the room where Maud was lying, and looked long and earnestly upon her white still face, and wondered in a vague kind of way if she knew he was there, and why he had never thought before what a nice kind of girl she was, and why he had not made more of her as her brother. "Maud," he whispered with a lump in his throat, "if you can hear me, I'd like to tell you I am sorry that I was ever mean to you, and I guess I did like you more than I supposed." Then he kissed her pale forehead and went to his room, where he smoked the night through, and in the morning felt as if he had lived 100 years since the previous night, and wondered how he should get through the day. It occurred to him that it might be the proper thing to see his mother, and after breakfast he went to her room, and was received by her with a burst of tears and reproaches for his indifference and lack of feeling in keeping himself away from everybody, as if it were nothing to him that Maud was dead, or that there was nothing for him to do. "Thunderation, mother!" Tom exclaimed. "Would you have me yell and scream and make a fool of myself? I sat up all night long, which was more than you did, and I've been meditating in the woods and have seen Maud and made it square with her. What more can I do?" "You can see to things," Mrs. Tracy replied. "Your father is all broken up and has gone to bed, and it is not becoming in me to be around. Somebody must take the helm." "And somebody has," Tom answered her. "Uncle Arthur is master of ceremonies now. He is running the ranch, and running it well, too." And Tom was right, for Arthur had taken the helm, and, aided and abetted by Jerry, was quietly attending to matters and arranging for the funeral, which Dolly said must be in the house, as she would not go to the church with a gaping crowd to stare at her. So it was to take place at the house on Friday afternoon, and Arthur ordered a costly coffin from New York, and nearly a carload of flowers and floral designs, for Jerry had explained to him Maud's wishes with regard to her grave, which they lined first with the freshest of the boughs from the 4 Pines, filling these again with flowers up to the very top, so that the grave when finished seemed like one mass of flowers, in which it would not be hard to lie. Dolly had objected to Billy as one of the pallbearers. He was too short, she said, and not at all in harmony with Dick and Fred and Paul Crosby, the young man who, in Harold's absence, had been asked to take his place. But Arthur overruled her with the words, "It was Maud's wish," and Billy kept his post. The day arrived, and the hour, and the people came in greater crowds than they had done when poor Jack was buried, or the dark woman Nanine, with only Jerry as chief mourner, and the procession was the longest ever seen in Shannondale. And Dolly, even while her heart was aching with bitter pain, felt a thrill of pride that so many were following her daughter to the grave. Arrived at the cemetery, there was a halt for the mourners to alight and the bearers to take the coffin from the hearse, A halt longer than necessary it seemed to Jerry, who did not see the young man making his way through the ranks of the people crowding the road, and straining every nerve to reach the hearse, which he did just as the bearers were taking the coffin from it. With a quick movement he put Paul Crosby aside, saying apologetically, "Excuse me, Paul. I must carry Maud to her grave. She wished it." Even then Jerry did not see him or dream that he was there, but when toward the close of the service she took a step or two forward to look into the grave before it was filled up, and he put a hand upon her shoulder and said, "Not too near, Jerry." She started suddenly with a suppressed cry, and turning saw him standing by her, tall and erect and self-possessed, as he faced the multitude, some of whom had suspected him of crime, but all of whom were ready now to do him justice and bid him welcome home. "Oh, Harold," Jerry said as she grasped his arm, "I am so glad you are here. I wish you had come before." Harold could not reply, for they were now leaving the spot, and many gathered around him. First and foremost Peterkin, who came tramping through the grass, puffing like an engine, and unmindful of the time or place, slapping him upon the shoulder as he said, "Well, my boy, glad to see you back. 'Pon my soul I be, but you frustrated all my plans. I was meanin' to give you an oblation. Got it all arranged, and you spiled it by taking us unawares like a thief in the night. I beg your pardon," he continued, as he met a curious look in Harold's eyes. "I'm a blunderin' cuss, I be. I didn't mean nothin'. I've never meant nothin', and if I have, I'm sorry for it." Harold did not hear the last, for he was handing Jerry into the carriage with her father, who bade him enter too, saying they would leave him at the cottage where he wished to go as soon as possible. There was no time for much conversation before the cottage was reached, and Harold alighted at the gate, and no allusion whatever was made to Jerry's changed relations until Harold stood looking at her as she kept her seat by her father, and made no sign of an intention to stop. Then he said as calmly as he could, "Do you stay at the Park house altogether now?" "Oh, no," she answered quickly. "I have been there a great deal with Maud, but I am coming home tonight. I could not leave Grandma alone, you know." She acknowledged the home and the relationship still, and Harold's face flushed with a look of pleasure which deepened in intensity when Arthur, with a wave of the hand habitual to him, said, "I must keep her now that you are here to see the grandmother, but will let you have her tonight. Come up later if you like, and walk home with her." "I shall be most happy to do so," Harold said, and then the carriage drove away while he went in to his grandmother, who had not attended the funeral, but who knew that he had returned and was waiting for him. Chapter 51. Under the Pines with Harold. It seemed to Harold that it had been 1,000 years since he left Shannondale, so much had come into and so much had gone out of his life since he said good-bye to the girl he loved and to the girl who loved him. One was dead, and he had only come in time to help lay her in her grave, while the other was, some might think, farther removed from him than death itself could have removed her. But Harold did not feel so. He had faith in Jerry, that she would not change, and when he read the judge's letter in the privacy of his room at the Tacoma, he rejoiced with an exceeding great joy that her home and birthright had been so strangely restored. He never doubted the story for a moment, but felt rather as if he had known it always, and wondered how anyone could have imagined for a moment that blue-eyed, golden-haired Jerry was the child of the dark, coarse-looking woman found dead beside her. "I am so glad for Jerry," he said, without a thought that her relations to himself would in any way be changed. Once, when she had told him of the fancies which haunted her so often, he had put them from him with a fear that, were they true, Jerry would be lost to him forever. But he had no such misgivings now, and when Jerry's letter came urging his return, both for her own sake and Maud's, he wrote a few hurried lines telling her how glad he was for her, and of his intention to start for the East as soon as possible. "Tomorrow, perhaps," he wrote, "in which case I may be there before this letter reaches you, for the mails are sometimes slow, and the judge's communication was overdue 3 or 4 days." Starting the second day after his letter, Harold traveled day and night, while something seemed beckoning him on. And when between St. Paul and Chicago there came a detention from a freight car off the track, he felt that he must fly, so sure was he that he was wanted and anxiously looked for at Tracy Park, where at that very time Maud was dying. The next afternoon he left Chicago, and with no further accident reached Shannondale just as the long procession was winding its way to the cemetery. He had heard from an acquaintance in Springfield that Maud was dead, and of her request that he should be one of the pallbearers, together with Dick and Fred and Billy. "And I will do it yet," he said with a throb of pain as he thought of the little girl who had died believing that he loved her. Once or twice he had resolved to write and tell her as carefully as possible of her mistake, but as often had changed his mind, thinking to wait until she was better, and the chance for explanation gone forever. But he would, if possible, carry out the wish she had expressed with regard to himself. Striking into the fields from the station, he reached the cemetery in time to take his place by Billy, and then he looked for Jerry, and felt an indefinable thrill when he saw her on her father's arm and began to realize that she was Jerry Tracy. But all that was over now. He had talked with her face to face, and had found her the same Jerry he had always known, and he was going to see her in her own home at Tracy Park, the daughter of the house, the heiress of Arthur Tracy, and of more than 2 millions, it was said. For despite Frank's extravagance, all of which Arthur had met without a protest, his money had accumulated rapidly, so that he was a much richer man now than when he first came home from Europe. Harold found the family at dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Tracy and Tom in the dining room, and Arthur and Jerry in the Gretchen room, to which he was taken at once. Come in, my boy. You are just in time for dessert," Arthur said, rising with alacrity and going forward to meet him; while Jerry, too, arose and took his hand, and made him sit by her, and questioned him of his journey, and helped him to the fairest peach and the finest bunch of grapes, and felt so proud of him, and of her father, too, as they talked together. And Harold showed no sign of any inequality, even if he felt it, which he did not. "A fine young man with the best of manners, and carries himself as if he were the Lord High Chancellor," Arthur said, when after dinner Harold left them to pay his respects to the other inmates of the family, whom he found just leaving the dining room. Dolly bowed to him coldly at first, and was about to pass on, when with a burst of tears she offered him her hand and said, "Oh, Harold, why didn't you come before? Maud wanted to see you so badly." This was a great deal for Dolly, and Tom stared at her in amazement, while Harold explained that he had come as soon as he possibly could, and tried to say something of Maud, but could not for the tears which choked him. Frank was unfeignedly glad to see him, and told him so. "Our dear little girl was fond of you, Hal. I am sure she was, and I shall always like you for that. Heaven bless you, my boy," he said as he wrung Harold's hand and then hurried away after his wife, leaving Harold alone with Tom, awfully afraid he should break down, said indifferently, "Glad to see you, Hal. Wish you had come before Maud died. She was in a tearin' way to see you. Have a cigar? Got a prime lot in my room. Will you go there?" Harold was in no mood for cigars, and declining Tom's offer, sauntered a while around the grounds, where he found himself constantly expecting to find the dead girl sitting under a tree waiting for him with the light whose meaning he now knew kindling in her beautiful eyes as she bade him welcome. He was glad now that he had not written and told her of her mistake, and he felt in his heart a greater tenderness for the Maud dead than he ever could have felt for the Maud living. It was beginning to grow dark when he returned to the house, where he found Jerry in the hall ready to go home. Arthur was at her side, with his arm thrown lovingly around her, and as he passed her over to Harold he said, "Make the most of her tonight, my boy, for tomorrow she comes home to stay." For a time Harold and Jerry walked on in silence, but when they reached the 4 Pines, Jerry halted suddenly and said, "Let us sit down, Harold. I have a message from Maud, which I promised to deliver the first time we were alone together, after you came home." Jerry's voice trembled a little, and after they were seated she was silent until Harold said to her, "You were going to tell me of Maud?" Then she started and replied, "Yes. She wanted so much to see you and tell you herself. I don't know what she meant, but she said she had made a mistake, and I must tell you so, and that you would understand it. She had been thinking and thinking, she said, and knew it was a stupid blunder of hers. That was what she called it, a stupid blunder, and she was sorry for you that she had made it, and bade me say so, and tell you no one knew but herself and you. Dear little Maud, I wish she had not died." Jerry was crying, and perhaps that was the reason she did not mind when Harold put his arm around her and drew her so close to him that his brown hair touched her golden curls, while the pines moaned and sighed above them for a moment and then grew still, as if listening for what Harold would say. "Yes," he began slowly, "I think I know what Maud meant by the mistake. Did she say I must tell you what it was? She said you would tell me, but perhaps you'd better not, Jerry replied. Yes, I must tell you, he continued, as a preliminary to what I have to say to you afterward, and what I did not mean to say quite so soon. But this decides me, and he drew Jerry closer to him as he went on. Did you ever think that I loved Maud? Yes, I have thought so, was Jerry's answer. She thought so too, Harold continued, and it was all my fault, not hers. She was so sweet and good and so interested in you and all I wanted to do for you, that I regarded her as a very dear friend, nothing more. And because I looked upon her this way, I foolishly went to her once to confess my love for another and ask if she thought I had a chance for success. I must have bungled strangely, for she mistook my meaning and thought I was speaking of herself, and in a way she accepted me. And before I had time to explain, her mother came in, and I have never seen her since. That is what Maud meant. She saw the mistake, and wished to rectify it by giving me the chance to tell you myself what I wanted to tell you then and dared not. Jerry trembled violently but made no answer, and Harold went on. It may seem strange that I, who used to be so much afraid of Jerry Crawford that I dared not tell her of my love, have the courage to do it now that she is Jerry Tracy, and I do not understand it myself. Once, when you told me your fancies concerning your birth, a great fear took possession of me, lest I should lose you if they were true. But when I heard that they were true, I felt so sure of you that I could scarcely wait for the time when I could ask you, as I now do, to be my wife, poor as I am, with nothing but love to give you. Will you, Jerry? His face was so close to hers now that her hot cheeks touched his, but she made no reply for a moment, and then she said, Oh, Harold, it seems so soon, with Maud only buried today. What shall I say? What ought I to say? Shall I tell you? He answered. Say the first English word you ever spoke, and which I taught you. Do you remember it? S came involuntarily from Jerry, in the quick lisping accent of her babyhood, when that was all the English she could master. And almost before it had escaped her, Harold smothered it with the kisses he pressed upon her lips as he claimed her for his own. But Harold, she tried to explain between his kisses, I meant that I did remember. You must not kiss me so fast. You take my breath away. There, I won't stand it any longer. I'm going straight home to tell Grandma how you act. And so am I, Harold said, rising as she did, but keeping his arm around her as they went slowly along in the soft September night, with the stars, which were shining for the first time on Maud's grave, looking down upon them, and a thought of Maud in their hearts, and her dear name often upon their lips, as they talked of the past, trying to recall just when it was that friendship ceased and love began, and deciding finally that neither knew nor cared when it was, so great was their present joy and anticipation of the future. End of chapters 50 and 51. Chapter 52 of Gretchen by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 52. For Better, for Worse. Grandma, Jerry has promised to be my wife, Harold said to his grandmother that night, and, Father, I have promised to marry Harold, Jerry said to Arthur the next morning as she stood before him, with Harold's hand in hers, and a look in her face something like what Gretchen's had worn when Arthur first called her his wife. Lord bless you, I knew it was coming, but didn't think it would be quite so soon. You shock my nerves dreadfully, Arthur exclaimed, springing up and walking 2 or 3 times across the room. Then, confronting the young couple, he said, Going to marry Harold? I knew you would all the time. Well, he will do as well as anyone to look after the business. Frank is no good, and Colvin is too old. So get married at once, within a week if you like. I'm off for Germany next month to find Gretchen's grave, and the house, and the picture, and everything, and as I shall take you with me, I shall need someone with brains to look after things while I am gone. But, Father, Jerry began, if I go to Germany, Harold will go too, and if he stays here, I shall stay. Arthur looked at her inquiringly a moment, and then, as he began to understand, replied, Ah, yes, I see. Where thou goest I go, and where thou, and so forth, and so forth. Well, all right, but you must be married here in your father's house, and soon, too. I'll engage passage at once in the Germanic, which sails the 15th of October, and you shall be married the 10th.
That's 3 weeks from today, and we'll give you a few days in New York. I'll leave Frank here till we return, and then he must go, of course, and the new mistress step in with Mrs. Crawford to superintend. We will get some nice man and woman to stay with her while we are gone." He had settled everything rapidly, but Jerry had something to say upon the subject. She did not wish to come to Tracy Park altogether while Mrs. Tracy was there, she said, and preferred to be married in the cottage, the only home she had ever known. "I shall stay with you all day," she continued, "but go home at night." "And so have a long walk with Harold. Yes, I see," Arthur said laughingly, but assenting finally to her proposal. It was Jerry now who planned everything, with Harold's assistance, and who broached the subject of Frank's future to her father, asking what provision he intended to make for him when he left Tracy Park. "What provision?" Arthur said. "I guess he has made provision for himself all these years, when my purse has been as free to him as myself. Colvin tells me there's been an awful lot of money spent somewhere." "Yes," Jerry replied, "but you gave him permission to spend it, and it would hardly be fair now to leave him with little or nothing, and he so broken down. When Maud thought she was going to die, and before she knew who I was, she wrote a letter for her father and you, asking him to give me what he would have given her, and you to do the same. So now I want you to give Maud's father what you would have given me for Maud's sake." "Bless my soul, Jerry," Arthur said, "what a beggar you are! I don't know what I should have given you. All I am worth, perhaps. How much will satisfy you for Frank? Tell me, and it is done." Jerry thought $100,000 would not be any too much, nor did it seem so to Arthur, who placed but little value upon his money, and Jerry was deputed to tell her uncle what provision was to be made for him, and that, if he wished, he was to remain at the Park until his brother's return from Europe. Frank was not in his own room, but Mrs. Tracy was, and to her Jerry first communicated the intelligence that she was to be married and go with her father to Germany. The look which the highly scandalized lady gave her was wonderful as she said, "Married! Almost before the crape is off the door, or the flowers wilted on Maud's grave! Well, that shows how little we are missed. And I am not surprised, though I think Maud would be, at Harold certainly. I suppose you know there was something between them. But a man will do anything for money. I wish you joy of your husband." Jerry was too indignant to explain anything, and hurried off in quest of her uncle, whom she found in Maud's room, where he spent most of his time, walking up and down and examining the different articles which had belonged to his daughter, and which at his request remained untouched as she had left them. Her brushes, her comb, her bottle of perfumery, her work-box, her Bible, her little half-finished sketch, and the soft bed-slippers she had worn when she died, and one of which he held in his hand when Jerry went in to him. "It is so like Maud," he said with quivering lips, "and when I hold it in my hand I can almost hear the dear little feet, which I know are cold and dead, coming along the hall as she used to come and will never come again. I think I should like to die here in this room and go where Maud has gone, and I believe I should go there. I am sure God has forgiven me, and Maud forgave me too, for I told her." "You did. I thought so," Jerry said. "Yes, I had to tell her," he continued, "and I am glad that I did, and she loved me just the same. You saw her die. You heard what she said to me. She must have believed in me, and that keeps me from going mad. I told Dolly, too, and she said she'd never speak to me again as long as she lived, and she didn't either until last night, when I was alone in here, crying on Maud's bed. Then she came to me and called me Frank, and said she was sorry she had been so hard, and asked me what we were going to do. I'm sure I don't know. Do you?" He was so like a child in his appeal to her that Jerry's tears came fast as she told him of her approaching marriage and what her father intended doing for him. Then Frank broke down entirely. "I don't deserve it, and I know I owe it to you, whom I have injured so much," he said, while Jerry tried to comfort him. "I must go back now to father," she said at last, and she went out into the hall, where she encountered Tom just coming from his mother's room. "Hello," Tom cried, with an attempt at a smile. "And so you are going to marry Harold?" "Yes, Tom, I'm going to marry Harold," Jerry replied, unhesitatingly, as she laid her hand on Tom's arm, and walked with him down the stairs. It seemed to her the most natural thing in the world that she should marry Harold, and she was not at all abashed in speaking of it to Tom.
and when they saw Harold coming up the walk, the color rushed to her cheeks and her eyes grew wondrously bright with the love-light which shone in them as she dropped Tom's arm and hurried to Harold's side. "By George, I believe I'll go and hang myself," Tom said under his breath as he stalked moodily away. But instead of that he went across the fields to Le Bateau, where he sat for an hour, talking with old Peterkin and waiting for Ann Eliza, who had gone to Springfield, her father said, after a new gown for which she was to pay $200. "Think on it," he continued. "When we was fust married and run the Liza Ann, the best gown Mary Jane had to her back was a mariner or balzarine, dummed if I know what you call it, at 1 9 a yard. But now, Lord land, what's a $200 gown to me? Ann Eliza can have 40 on 'em if she wants to. There she is. There's the carriage. By gosh, though, ain't she a neat little filly?" And the father's face glowed with pride as he watched his daughter alighting from the carriage, to which Tom had hastened in order to assist her, for she was still a little lame and limped as she walked. He saw the $200 gown, for Peterkin would have it displayed, and admired it, of course, and wished that he had half the sum it cost in his own right, and wondered if he could stand it as he walked slowly home, where he heard from his mother that they were still to remain at Tracy Park for a while, and that his father was to have $100,000 settled upon him. "I guess now I'll wait a spell and let old Peterkin go to thunder," he decided, and for 2 weeks and more Ann Eliza watched in vain for his coming, while Peterkin remarked to his wife that if Tom Tracy was going to play fast and loose with his gal, he'd find himself brought up standing mighty lively. The news that Harold and Jerry were soon to be married and go with Arthur to Germany created some surprise and some talk too in town, where many of the people had believed that there had been an understanding, if not an engagement, between Harold and Maude. But Tom put that right with a few decided words. There had never been an engagement, he said. Maude had liked Harold very much, and he had liked her, but had always preferred Jerry. In short, matters had been as good as settled between them long ago. This last was a little fiction of Tom's brain, but the people accepted it as true, and began to look eagerly forward to the approaching marriage, which took place in Mrs. Crawford's parlor, with only a few intimate friends present. Grace Atherton, the St. Clairs, Ann Eliza Peterkin, and the Tracys, with the exception of Dolly, who could not do so great violence to her feelings as to attend a wedding. Billy was not there, but he sent a magnificent emerald ring to Jerry with the following note: "Dear Jerry, I can't see you married, although I am glad for you and glad for Hal. God bless you both. I shall never forget you as long as I live, and when you come back, maybe I can bear to see you as Hal's wife. But now it would kill me. Goodbye." Jerry read this note with wet eyes, and then passed it to Harold, to whom she told of that episode under the butternut tree when Billy asked her to be his wife. "I am awful sorry for him, but I can't let him have you, Jerry," Harold said, passing the note back to her and kissing her tenderly as he added, "That is my last for Jerry Tracy, my little girl of the carpet-bag. When I kiss you again, you will be my wife." "Come, children, we are waiting," came with startling distinctness from Arthur at the foot of the stairs, and then Harold and Jerry went down to the parlor, where they were soon made one, Arthur giving the bride away, and behaving pretty well under the circumstances. He had been very flighty the day before, insisting that Jerry should be married in white, with a blue ribbon on her bonnet, just as Gretchen had been, and when she reminded him of Maude's recent death, he replied, "Well, Gretchen will wear colors if you don't." And he brought out and laid upon his bed the dress which had been waiting for Gretchen on that stormy night when he heard the wild cry of the dying woman above the wintry gale. She was with him again in fancy, and when he went out to the carriage which was to take him to the cottage, he stepped back and stood a moment by the door as if to let someone enter before him, and during the ceremony those nearest to him heard him whispering to himself, "I, Arthur, take thee, Gretchen," and so forth. But when it was over he seemed perfectly rational, as he kissed his daughter and shook hands with his son-in-law, to whom he gave a check for $10,000, saying as he did so that young men must have a little spending money. It was a very pleasant wedding, and everyone seemed happy, even to Dick, whose spirits, however, were rather too gay to be quite natural, and whose voice shook a little as he called Jerry Mrs. Hastings, and told her he hoped to see her in Paris in the spring, as he thought of going over there with Nina to join the Raymonds. "Oh, I hope you will. Nothing could make me so happy as to meet you there," Jerry said, looking at him with an expression which told him she was thinking of the Pines and was sorry for him. The newly married pair were going directly to New York, where Arthur was to join them on the 14th as the Germanic sailed the 15th. All the wedding guests accompanied them to the station, Tom accepting a seat in the coupe with Ann Eliza, who wore her $200 gown, and was, of course, overdressed. But Tom did not think much about that. He was ill at ease that morning, though trying to seem natural, and when the train which took Jerry away disappeared from view, he felt as if everything which had made life desirable had left him forever, and he cared but little now what he did, or with whom his lot was cast. So when Ann Eliza said to him, "It is such a fine day. Suppose we drive along the river. It may dispel the blues," he assented, and soon found himself bowling along the smooth turnpike with Ann Eliza, whom he thought rather interesting, with the tears shed for Jerry on her long light eyelashes. "I shall miss her so much, and be so lonely without her. I hope you'll call often," she said to him, when at last the drive was over, and Tom promised that he would, and kept his promise too. For after Arthur left, he found Tracy Park so insupportably dull, with his father always in Maud's room and his mother always in tears, that it was a relief to go to Le Bateau and be made much of as if he were a prince, and treated to nice little lunches and suppers, even if old Peterkin did make one of the party, and disgust him so at times that he felt as if he must snatch up his hat and fly. And one night, when the old man had been more than usually disagreeable and pompous, he did start up abruptly and leave the house, mentally vowing never to enter it again. "I'd rather saw wood than listen to that infernal old brag," he was saying to himself, when he heard a wheezy sound behind him, and looking around saw the old brag in full pursuit and beckoning him to stop. "I'm going to walk a spell with you," he said, locking his arm in Tom's as he came up. "I want to have a talk." "Yes," Tom faltered with a dreadful sinking of the heart, while Peterkin went on. "You see, you've been a-comin' to love her too off and on for mighty nigh a month, and as the parent of a family it's time I asked your intentions." "Intentions?" Tom stammered, trying to draw his arm from Peterkin's. But he might as well have tried to wrench it from a vice, for Peterkin held it fast and went on. "Yes, intentions. Thunderation, ain't a chap supposed to have intentions when he hangs round a gal who has money like my Ann Liza? I tell you what, Thomas," and his manner became very insinuating and frank, "as nigh as I can calculate I'm worth 3 millions fair and square, and there's 3 on 'em to divide it amongst. May Jane, Bill, and Ann Liza. Now, supposin' we say 3's into 3 million, don't it leave 1 million? Tom acknowledged that it did, and Peterkin continued. "Just so. Now, I ain't one of them mean skunks that wants his folks to wait till he's dead afore they enjoys themselves. And the day my Ann Liza is married, I planked down 1 million in hard cash for her and her husband to do what they darned pleased with. Cut a dash in Europe as Hal is doing if they like, or cut a splurge to hum, it's all one to me. I call that square, don't you?" Tom admitted that he did, and Peterkin went on. "Now then, I ain't a-goin' to have Ann Liza's affections trifled with, and if I catch a feller a-doin' it, do you know what I'll do?" Tom could not guess, and Peterkin continued. "I'll lick him within an inch of his life, and then set the dogs on him and heave him into the river, you see." It was not a warm day, but Tom was perspiring at every pore as he saw presented to him the choice between 1 million or to be licked within an inch of his life and then dogged into the river. Naturally, he chose the first as the lesser evil of the two, and began to lie as he had never lied in his life before. He was very glad, he said, that Peterkin had broached the subject, as it made matters easier for him by showing him that his suit would not be rejected, as he had feared it might be. "You know, of course, Mr. Peterkin," he said, "that I am now a poor young man, with no expectations whatever, for though Uncle Arthur has settled something upon father, I cannot depend upon that, and how could I dare to look as high as your daughter without some encouragement?" "Encouragement, boy? Great Scott!" And releasing Tom's arm, Peterkin hit him a friendly slap, which nearly knocked him down. "Great Scott! What do you call encouragement? When a gal is so flustified at seeing you that she tetters right up and down, while her mother hunts heaven and earth for tidbits to tickle your palate, with quail on toast, mushrooms, sweet breads, and the Lord knows what. Ain't that a sign they are willin'? Thunder and guns, what would you have?
Ann Liza can't up and say, marry me, Tom, nor I can't up and say, Thomas, marry my daughter, can I? But if you want to marry her, say so like a man, and I swan I'll meet you like a man and a father."
Alas for Tom, he had nothing left him to do except to say that he wished to marry Ann Eliza, and that he would come the next evening and tell her so. It was Peterkin who answered his ring when he presented himself at the door of Le Bateau, Peterkin more inflated and pompous than ever as he shook the young man's hand, calling him Thomas, and telling him to go right into the parlor, where he would find Ann Liza waiting for him, and where they could bill and coo as much as they liked, for he and May Jane would keep out of the way and give 'em a chance. Even then Tom cast one despairing glance toward the door with a half resolve to bolt, but Peterkin was behind him, pushing him on to his fate, which after all was not so very bad when he came to face it. There was nothing low or mean or coarse about Ann Eliza, who was by no means ill-looking, as she stood up to receive her lover with a droop in her eyes and a flush on her cheeks, for she knew the object of his visit, into which he plunged at once. He did not say that he loved her, but he asked her in a straightforward way to be his wife, and then waited for her answer, which was not long in coming, for Ann Eliza was no dissembler. She loved Tom Tracy with her whole soul, and felt herself honored in being sought by him. "Oh, Tom," she said, "it does not seem possible for you to love me, but if you really do, I will be your wife and try to make you happy, and... She hesitated a moment, and then went on. "Save you as much as possible from father. We cannot live here. You and he would not get on. He means well and is the kindest of fathers to me, but he is not like you, and we must go away." She was really a very sensible girl, Tom thought, and in his joy at finding her so sensible he stooped and kissed her forehead as the proper thing for him to do, while she, the poor little mistaken girl, threw herself into his arms and began to cry, she was so glad and happy. Tom did not know exactly what he ought to do. It was a novel situation for him to be in, with the girl sobbing on his bosom, and his first impulse was to push her off. But when he remembered that she represented $1,000,000, he did what half the men in the world would have done in his place. He held her close and tried to quiet her, and told her he was not half good enough for her, and knew in his heart he was telling the truth, and felt within him the stirring of a resolve that she should never know he did not love her, and that he would make her happy if he could. And so they were betrothed, and Peterkin came in with May Jane and made a speech half an hour long to his future son-in-law, and settled just when they were to be married and what they were to do. Christmas week was the time, and he vowed he'd give him a wedding which should take the starch entirely out of Gusty Brown, whose mother, Mrs. Rossiter Brown, would think Gusty was never married at all when she saw what he could do. Greatly he lamented that Harold and Jerry could not be present. "But they'll see it in the papers," he said, "for I'll have a 4-column notice if I write it myself and pay for it too. And when you meet 'em in Europe you can tell 'em what they missed." To all this Tom listened with great drops of cold sweat running down his back, as he thought of the ridicule he should incur if Peterkin carried out his intentions, to take the rag off the bush, as he expressed it. The trip to Europe pleased him, but the party filled him with horror from which he saw no escape, and he was anything but a happy man when he at last said good-bye to Peterkin, who slipped into his hand a check for $2,000, saying, when he protested against taking it, "Don't be a fool, Thomas. I'm to be your dad, so take it, you'll need it. I know your circumstances. They ain't what they was, and I don't suppose you've got enough to buy the engagement ring. I want a big one. A solitary. No cluster for me. I know what 'tis to be poor. Take it, Thomas." So Tom took it with a sense of shame which prompted him several times to tear it in shreds and throw them to the winds. But this he did not do, for he knew he should need money, as he had none of his own, and when a few days before he had asked Colvin for some, that worthy man, who had never taken kindly to him, had bidden him go to a very warm place for money, as he had no orders to give him any. "Your uncle," he said, "settled $100,000 on your father, the more fool he, and expects him to live on it. So my advice to you is that you go to work." Now Tom couldn't work, and after a little Peterkin's gift did not seem so very humiliating to him, although he could not bring himself to tell his mother of it when he announced his engagement to her, which he did bluntly, and with nothing apologetic in his manner or speech. "I am going to marry Ann Eliza Peterkin sometime during the holidays, and start at once for Europe," he said, and then brought some water and dashed it in her face, for she immediately went into hysterics and declared herself dying. When she grew calm, Tom swore a little, and talked a good deal, and told her about the $1,000,000, which he said was not to be sneezed at, and told her what Colvin had said to him, and asked what the old Harry he was to do if he didn't marry Ann Eliza, and told her of the proposed party, asking her to save him from it if she could. When she found she could not help herself, Dolly rose to the situation, and said she would see her daughter-in-law elect, whom Tom was to bring to her, as she could not think of calling at Le Bateau in her present state of affliction. So Ann Eliza came over, and her mother came with her. But the latter Dolly declined to see. She could not endure everything, she said to Tom, and was only equal to Ann Eliza, whom she met with a bow and the tips of her fingers, without rising from her chair. Still, as the representative of $1,000,000, Ann Eliza was entitled to some consideration, and Dolly motioned her to a seat beside her, and with her black bordered handkerchief to her eyes, said to her, "Tom tells me that you are going to marry him, and I trust you will try to make him happy. He is a most estimable young man now, and if he should develop any bad habits, I shall think it owing to some new and bad influence brought to bear upon him." "Yes'm," Ann Eliza answered timidly, and the great lady went on to talk of family, and blood, and position, as something for which money could not make amends, and to impress upon the girl a sense of the great honor it was to be a member of the Tracy family. Then she spoke of the wedding party, which she trusted Ann Eliza would prevent, as nothing could be in worse taste when they were in such affliction, adding that neither herself nor Mr. Tracy could think of being present. "Be married quickly, without any display, if you wish to please me," she said, and with a wave of her handkerchief she signified that the conference was ended. "Well, Annie, how did you and my lady hit it?" Tom asked, meeting Ann Eliza in the hall as she came out, flushed and hot from the interview. "We didn't hit it at all," Ann Eliza replied with a gleam in her eye which Tom had never seen before. "She just talked as if I were dirt, and that you were only marrying me for my money. She don't like me, and I don't like her, there," and the indignant little girl began to cry. Tom laughed immoderately, and passing his arm around her as they went down the stairs, he said, "Of course you don't like her. Whoever did like her mother-in-law? But you are marrying me, not my mother, so don't cry, petite." Tom was making an effort to be very kind and even lover-like to his fiancée, who was easily comforted, and who on her return to Le Bateau told her father plainly that the party must be given up, as it would be out of place and deeply offend the Tracys. Very unwillingly Peterkin gave it up, and sent word to that effect to Mrs. Rossiter Brown, who had already been apprised of the coming event and was having a wonderful gown made for the occasion. "I find," he wrote, "that it wouldn't be at all Rachel Shea to have a blow-out whilst the family is in deep black. But when they get into lavender and the young folks is home from their tower, I'll have a terror." Peterkin tried 2 or 3 times to see Mrs. Tracy, but she put him off with one excuse after another, until Tom took the matter in hand and told her she was acting like a fool and putting on quite too many airs. Then she appointed an interview, and bracing herself with a tonic, went down to the darkened, cheerless room, and by her manner so managed to impress him with her superiority over him and his, that he forgot entirely the speech he had prepared with infinite pains, and which had in it a good deal about family bonds and family units, and Aaron's beard and brotherly love. This he had rehearsed many times to May Jane, with wonderful gestures and flourishes. "But I'll be bumped," he said to her on his return from the Park House, "if I didn't forget every blessed word, she was so high and mighty. Lord, as if I didn't know what she sprung from. But that's the way with them as was born to nothin'. May Jane, if I ever catch you puttin' on airs 'cause you're a Peterkin, I believe I'll kill you." After this, anything like familiar intercourse ceased between the heads of the 2 families until the morning after Christmas Day, when Frank and Dolly drove over to Le Bateau, where were assembled the same people who had been present at Jerry's wedding, and where Peterkin insisted upon darkening the rooms and lighting the gas, as something a little out of the usual order of things in Shannondale. Peterkin was very happy and very proud of this alliance with the Tracys, and his pride and happiness shone in his face all through the ceremony, and when the clergyman asked, "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" his manner was something grand to see, as he stepped forward and responded, "I do, sir," in a voice so loud and full of importance that Dolly involuntarily groaned, while Tom found it hard to refrain from laughing. Tom behaved very well, and kissed his bride before anyone else had a chance to do so, and called Mary Jane mother and Peterkin father after he saw the papers which made Ann Eliza possessor in her own right of $1 million. And when an hour later she handed over to him as his own a deed of property valued at $100,000, he took her in his arms and kissed her again, telling her, what was very true, that she was worth her weight in gold. Tom had felt his poverty keenly, and all the more so that Ann Eliza's engagement ring, a superb solitaire, had been bought with her father's gift, as had their passage tickets to Europe. But now he was a rich man, made so by his wife's thoughtful generosity, and he was conscious of a new set of feelings and emotions with regard to her, and inwardly vowed that he would make her happy. They took the train for New York that afternoon, accompanied by Peterkin, who, when the ship sailed away next day, stood upon the wharf waving his hands and calling out as long as they could hear him, "God bless you, my children! God bless you, my children!" Then he went back to Shannondale and called at Tracy Park, and reported to Frank that the youngsters had gone, and that Mrs. Thomas Tracy looked as well as the best on 'em in the ship, and a darned sight better than some. After this, the great houses of Le Bateau and Tracy Park settled down into perfect quiet, especially that of Tracy Park, where Dolly shut herself up in her mourning and crape, and Frank spent most of his time in Maud's room, with her photograph in his hand, and his thoughts busy with memories of the dear little girl lying in her grave of flowers under the winter snow. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Gretchen by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 53. After 2 years. 2 years since Harold and Jerry went away, and it was October again, and the doors and windows of the Park House were all open to the warm sunshine which filled the rooms, where the servants were flitting in and out with an air of importance and pleased expectancy, for that afternoon the master was coming home with Harold and Jerry. And what was more wonderful and exciting still, there was in the party a little boy, born in Wiesbaden 6 months before, and christened Frank Tracy. They had gone directly to Germany, Arthur, Harold, and Jerry, for the former would not stop a day until Wiesbaden was reached, and there, overcome with fatigue and the recollections of the past which crowded upon him so fast, Arthur fell sick and was confined to his room at the hotel for a week, during which time Jerry explored the city with Harold and a guide, finding every spot connected with Gretchen and her life, even to the shop where Frau Heinrich had sold her small wares. As soon as her father was able, she took him to them one by one. Hand in hand, for he seemed weak as a little child, they went to the bench under the trees, where he had first seen Gretchen knitting in the sunshine, with the halo on her hair, and here Arthur took off his hat as if on consecrated ground, and whispered, "May God forgive me." Then to the little shop once kept by Frau Heinrich, where Arthur astonished the woman by buying out half her stock, which he ordered sent to his hotel and afterward gave away. Then to the English church, where he knelt before the altar and seemed to be praying, though the words he said were spoken more to Gretchen than to God. Then to the house where he had lived with his bride, when heaven came down so close that she could touch it, or rather to the site of the house, for fire had done its work there, and they could only stand before the ruins, while Arthur said again and again, "May God forgive me." Then to the house where Jerry had lived and Gretchen had died, and where the picture still hung upon the wall, a wonder and delight to all who had rented the place since Marion's parents lived there. Jerry recognized it in a moment, and so did Arthur, but he could only wring his hands before it and sob, "Oh, Gretchen, my darling, my darling." Changed as the house was, Jerry found the room where she had played and her mother had died. "The big stove stood here," she said, indicating the spot, "and Mother sat there writing to you, when Nanine opened the door and let the firelight shine upon the paper. I can see it all so distinctly. And over there in the corner was the bed where she died." Then Arthur knelt down upon the spot, and, as if the oft-repeated ejaculation, "May God forgive me," were wholly inadequate now, he said the Lord's Prayer, with folded hands and streaming eyes, while Jerry stood over him with her arm around his neck. "Oh, Gretchen," he cried, "do you know I am here after so many years? Arthur, your husband, who loved you through all. Come back to me, Gretchen, and I'll be so tender and true. Tender and true. My heart is breaking, Gretchen, and only for Cherry, our little girl baby, I should wish I were dead like you. Oh, Gretchen, Gretchen, sweetest wife a man ever called his. And yet I forgot you, darling, forgot that you had ever lived. May heaven forgive me, I could not help it. I forgot everything. Where are you, Cherry? It's getting so dark and cold, and Gretchen is not here. I think you must take me home. Jerry took him back to the hotel, where he kept his room for 3 days, and then they went to Gretchen's grave beside her mother, which Jerry had found after some little search and inquiry. Here Arthur stood like a statue, holding fast to Jerry, and gazing down upon the neglected grave, on which clumps of withered grass were growing and blowing in the November wind. "Gretchen is not in this place," he said mournfully with a shake of his head. "She couldn't rest here a moment, for she liked everything beautiful and bright, and this is like the potter's field. But we'll put up a monument for her, and make the place attractive. And by, when she is tired of wandering about, she may come back and rest when she sees what we have done, and knows that we have been here. We will buy that house, too," he said, as he walked away from the lonely grave. And the next day Harold found the owner and commenced negotiations for the house, which soon changed hands and became the property of Arthur. Just what he meant to do with it he did not know, until Jerry suggested that he make it an asylum for homeless children, who should receive the kindest and tenderest care from competent and trustworthy nurses hired for the purpose. "Yes, I'll do it," Arthur said, "and we'll call it the Gretchen Home. Maybe she will come there some time and know what I have done." This idea once in his mind, Arthur never let go of it until the house was fitted up with schoolrooms and dormitories, and filled with little ones rescued from want and misery. The general supervision of this home was placed in the hands of the English rector, the Reverend James Hart, whose many acts of kindness and humanity among the poor had won for him the sobriquet of St. James, and with whom the interests of the children were safe as with a loving father. "There is money enough," Arthur said, when giving his instructions to the matron, a good-natured woman who, he knew, would never abuse a child. "Money enough, so give them something beside bread and water for breakfast, and mush and molasses for supper. Children like cookies and custard pie, and if there comes a circus to town, let them go once in a while. It won't hurt them to see a little of the world." Frau Hirsch looked at him in some surprise, but promised compliance with his wishes. And when in the middle of December he left Wiesbaden for Italy, he had the satisfaction of knowing that the inmates of the Gretchen home were enjoying a bill of fare not common in institutions of the kind. It was not difficult to find in Wiesbaden people who remembered Gretchen and the grand marriage she had made with the rich American who afterward abandoned her. That was the way they worded it, and they remembered, too, the little girl Jerrine, whom after her mother's death the nurse Nanine took to her father's friends, since which nothing had been heard from her. Thus, had there been in Arthur's mind any doubt as to Jerry's identity, it would have been swept away. But there was none. He had accepted her from the first as his daughter, and he always looked up to her as a child to its mother whom it fears to lose sight of. The winter was mostly spent in Rome, where Harold and Jerry visited every part of the city, while Arthur stayed in his room talking to an unseen Gretchen, who afforded him almost as much satisfaction as the real one might have done. In May they went to the lakes, and in June drifted to Paris, where Jerry was overjoyed to meet Nina and Dick, who were staying with the Raymonds at a charming chateau just outside the city. Here she and Harold passed a most enjoyable week, and before she left she was made happy by something which she saw and which told her that Dick was forgetting that night under the pines, and that some day not far in the future he would find in Marion all he had once hoped to find in her. In Paris, too, she came upon Anne Eliza at the Bon Marché, with silks and satins piled high around her, and 2 or 3 obsequious clerks in attendance, for La Petite Américaine was well known to the tradespeople, who eagerly sought her patronage and that of my lord Monsieur, who impressed them greatly with his air of importance and dignity. Tom was enjoying himself immensely, and was really a good deal improved and very kind to his little wife, whom he always addressed as Petite or Madame, and who was quite a belle and a general favorite in the American colony. Following a fashion, which Tom was sure had been made for his benefit, she had cut off her obnoxious red hair and substituted in its place a wig of reddish brown, which for naturalness and beauty was a marvel of art and skill, and became her so well that Tom really thought her handsome, or at least very stylish and stunning, which was better than mere beauty. They had a suite of rooms at the Continental, and there Harold and Jerry dined with them in their private parlour, for Tom was too fine a gentleman to go to table d'hote with the common herd. Ann Eliza's grand maid, Doris, was with her still, and had come to look upon her young mistress as quite as great a personage as the Lady Augusta Hardy, whom she had ceased to quote, and who, with her mother, Mrs. Rossiter Brown, was now in the city, attended, it was said, by a Polish count, who had an eye upon her money. Once when they were alone, Jerry asked Tom when he was going home, and with a comical twinkle in his eye he replied, "When I hear that my respected father-in-law has gone off with apoplexy, and not before." Jerry thought this a shocking speech, but she was glad to see him so happy, and as she told Harold, so much more of a man than she had ever supposed he could be. That summer Harold and Jerry spent in Switzerland with the Raymonds and St. Clairs and Tracys, while Arthur went to Wiesbaden to see the Gretchen home, which he found so much to his taste that he remained there until Harold and Jerry, after a trip through Austria and Germany, joined him in November, when they went again for the winter to Italy, coming back in the spring to Wiesbaden, and because Arthur would have it so, taking up their abode for a while in the Gretchen home, which had been greatly enlarged and improved, and now held 30 deserted and homeless children. Here, in April, Jerry's little boy was born, in the same room and corner where Gretchen had died, and where Arthur again went down upon his knees and said the Lord's Prayer, to which he added a fervent thanksgiving for Jerry spared and a baby given to him. "I hoped it would be a girl," he said, "for then we should have called it Gretchen. But as it is a boy, suppose we name it Heinrich." "No, father," Jerry said decidedly. "Baby is not to be Heinrich or Arthur or Harold, although I think the last the dearest name in the world," and she put up her hand caressingly to the browned beard of the tall young man bending over to kiss her pale face and look at his son. "We will call the baby Frank Tracy." And so Frank Tracy was the name given to the child, who was more like its father than its mother, and whom Arthur called Tracy, which he liked better, he said, than he did Frank. They remained in Wiesbaden until June, then went to Switzerland and Paris, and in October sailed for home, where the Park house was ready for them, with no mistress to dispute Jerry's rights, and no master except the lawful one. Just out of town, on a grassy ridge overlooking the river, a gentleman from New York had built a pretty little cottage, which, as his wife died suddenly, he never occupied, but offered for sale with all its furniture and appointments. "Let's buy it," Dolly said to her husband. "We must go somewhere before Arthur comes home, and we can live there very respectably and economically, too." She was beginning to count the cost of everything, and was almost penurious in her efforts to make their income go as far as possible. So they bought the pretty place, which she called Ridge Cottage, but Frank did not live to occupy it. After Tom went away and left him alone with his wife, who was not the most agreeable of companions, he failed rapidly, both in body and mind, and those who saw him walking about the house with his white hair and bent form would have said he was 70 rather than 50 years old. Every day, when the weather permitted, he visited Maud's grave, where he sometimes stayed for hours, looking down upon the mound and talking to the insensible clay beneath. "I am coming, Maud, very soon, to be here beside you," he would say. "Everybody has gone, even to Tom, and your mother is sometimes hard upon me because of what I did. And I am tired and cold and old, and the world is dark and dreary, and I am coming very soon." Then he would walk slowly back, taking the post office on his way to inquire for letters from the folks, as he designated the absent ones. These letters were a great comfort to him, especially those from Jerry, who wrote him very often and told him all they were doing and seeing, and tried to make him understand how much she loved and sympathized with him. Not a hint had been given him of the baby, and when in June he received a letter from her containing a photograph of the little boy named after him, he seemed childish in his joy, and started with the picture at once for Maud's grave. Kneeling down with his face in the long grass, he whispered, "Look, Maud, Jerry's baby boy, named for me, Frank Tracy. Do you hear me, Maud? Frank Tracy, for me who wronged her so. God bless Jerry and give her many years of happiness when I'm dead and gone, which will not now be long. I am coming very soon, Maud, sooner than you think, and shall never see Jerry's little boy. God bless him." That night Frank seemed brighter than usual and talked a great deal with his wife, who to the last day of her life will be glad that she was kind to him and humored all his fancies. and once, when he lay upon the couch with the baby's picture in his hand, she went and sat by him and ran her fingers caressingly through his white hair, and asked if he were not better. "Yes, Dolly," he said, taking her fingers in his hand and holding them fast. "A great deal better. Jerry's baby has done me good, and you too, Dolly. You don't know how nice it seems to have you smooth my hair. It is like the old days at Langley when we sang in the choir together and you were fond of me." "I am fond of you now, Frank," Dolly replied as she stooped to kiss the face in which there was a look she had never seen before, and which haunted her long after he had said good night and gone to Maud's room, where he said he would sleep, as he was likely to be restless and might keep her awake. The next morning Dolly took her breakfast alone, for Frank did not join her. "Let him sleep," she said to the servant who suggested calling him. But when some time later he did not appear, she went herself to Maud's room, into which the noonday sun was shining, for every blind and window was open, and the light was so dazzling that for a moment she did not see the still figure stretched upon the bed, where, with Maud's picture in one hand and Jerry's baby's in the other, her husband lay, calmly sleeping the sleep which knows no waking. On his face there was a look of rapturous joy, and on his lips a smile as if they were framing the loved name of Maud when death came and sealed them forever. Around him was no sign of struggle or pain, for the covering was not disturbed, and the physician when he came said he must have died quietly and possibly instantly without a note of warning. They buried him beside his daughter, and then Dolly was alone in the house, which became so intolerable to her that she left it in early August, and took possession of the cottage on the ridge, which did not seem haunted with the ghosts of the dead. And so it happened that Mrs. Crawford alone stood in the doorway to welcome the travellers when, late in the bright October afternoon, they came, tired and dusty, but so glad to be home once more and to feel that now it really was home to all intents and purposes. "I was never so glad in my life, and if Uncle Frank were here I should be perfectly happy," Jerry cried, as she threw herself upon Mrs. Crawford's neck, hugging and kissing her a while, and then taking her baby from the nurse she put it into the old lady's arms, saying as she did so, "Another grandson for you. Harold's baby. Isn't he a beauty?" And little Tracy was a beautiful child, with his father's features and complexion, but Jerry's expression and ways, and Mrs. Crawford felt, as she folded him to her bosom, that he would be the crowning joy of her old age. At first Harold puzzled and perplexed her, he was so changed from the Harold who had shingled roofs and painted barns and worked in Peterkin's furnace. Foreign travel and prosperity set well upon him, and one could scarcely have found a more refined or polished young man than Harold as he moved about the premises, with a smile and pleasant word for everyone, whether of high or low degree. He had known what poverty meant, with slights on account of it, and had risen above it all, and remembering the days when he worked in the Tracy fields and envied his companions their leisure and freedom from toil, he had resolved that, if possible, some portion of mankind should be happier because of him. All Shannondale hastened to call upon the travellers, and no one was louder or more demonstrative in his welcome than Peterkin, who called himself their kin, and was very proud of the connection and of his son Thomas, for whom he made many inquiries. It did not take long for the family to settle down into everyday quiet, Jerry proving herself a competent and thorough housekeeper, while Harold was, to all intents and purposes, the head to whom everyone deferred and went for directions. Arthur, who had half died from seasickness, had at once taken to his rooms and his old mode of life, telling Harold and Jerry to do what they liked and not bother him. One change, however, he made. He put Harold into the office in the place of Colvin, who had done his business for so many years, and who was glad to give it up, while Harold was glad to take it, as it gave him something to do, and did not greatly interfere with his law studies, which he immediately resumed, applying himself so closely that he was admitted to practice within the year, and in time became one of the ablest lawyers in the state. For another year the Raymonds and St. Clairs remained abroad, and then, just before they sailed for home, there was a double wedding one morning in London, when Fred and Dick were the bridegrooms, and Marian and Nina were the brides. Dick had not forgotten the night under the pines, but he had ceased to remember it with pain. And when he asked Marian to be his wife, he told her of it, and of his old love for Jerry, while she in turn told him of a grave among the Alps, by which she had stood with an aching heart, while strangers buried from her sight a young artist from Boston, who, had he lived, would have made it impossible for her to be the wife of Dick St. Clair. But Alan was dead, and Jerry was a wife and mother, and so across the graves of a living and a dead love the two grasped hands, and forgetting the past as far as possible, were content with the new happiness offered to them. Nina's home was to be in Kentucky, but Marian stayed at Grassy Spring and became Jerry's most intimate friend and a constant visitor at Tracy Park, where she is always welcome. It is 5 years now since Harold and Jerry came home, and toddling about the house is a little girl whom they call Gretchen, and who has all the soft beauty of the Gretchen in the picture, together with Jerry's stronger and more marked features. This little girl is Arthur's idol, and has succeeded in luring him from his room, in which, until she came, he was staying closer than ever. Now, however, he is with her constantly, either in the house or in the grounds, or sitting under a tree holding her in his lap, while he talks his strange talk to the other Gretchen, and the child listens wonderingly with her great blue eyes fixed upon him. "This is our grandchild," he will say, nodding to the space beside him, while little Gretchen nods too, as if she also saw a figure sitting there. "Our grandchild and Jerry's baby, and you are its grandmother. Grandma Gretchen, that's funny." And then he laughs, and baby laughs, and says after him, lispingly, "Grandma Gretchen, that's funny." Then Tracy comes up with his whip and his cart and his straw hat hanging down his back, and Arthur points him out to the spirit Gretchen as her grandson, who, he says, is all Hastings, with a very little Tracy, and not a grain of German in him. But very, very nice, and you are his grandmother too, and I am his grandfather, whom he once called an old crazy man, because I wouldn't let him play in my room with a little alligator which his Aunt Dolly, that's Mrs. Frank Tracy, sent him from Florida. "Well, you be crazy, ain't you?" the boy says, seating himself upon the bench and nestling his brown head against the arm of the man, who replies, "I don't know whether I am or not, but if to be very happy in the companionship of the living and of the dead, and to have one as real as the other is craziness, then I am crazy. But God is good, and when he took Gretchen from me, he sent me your mother in the carpet-bag. Praised be God." And then, for the 100th time, he tells to the boy, and to the baby too, the story of the carpet-bag and the little girl, their mother, whom the boy, their father, found in the Tramp House one wintry morning years ago, and carried through the snow. And Tracy, who is very chivalrous and very brave, and old for his years, starts to his feet with dilating eyes, and says, "I just wish I'd been there. I'd carried Mama, and wouldn't let her drop in the snow as Papa did. Where was I then, Grandpa?" But Grandpa does not answer, and begins the story of the cherries and the ladder, which Tracy likes even better than that of the carpet-bag, particularly the part where the sunbonnet appears in the window and the shrill voice calls out, "Mr. Crazy Man, Mr. Crazy Man, don't you want some cherries?" This Arthur makes very dramatic and real, and Tracy holds his breath, and sometimes, when the question is more real than usual, little Gretchen puts out her hand and says, "Yes, give me some." Then the boy and the old man laugh, and Tracy runs after a passing butterfly, and Arthur goes on with his talk to the baby until she falls asleep, and he takes her to the crib he has had put in the bay window under the picture which smiles down upon the sleeping infant, whose guardian angel it seems to be. The Tramp House has been repaired and renovated, the table mended, and the rat-hole stopped up. And the trio frequently go there together, for it is the children's playhouse, where Arthur is sometimes a horse, sometimes a bear, and sometimes a whole menagerie of animals, just as the fancy takes the restless, active Tracy. Once or twice Arthur has been the dead woman on the table, with little Gretchen beside him in the carpet-bag, and Tracy tugging with all his might to lift her out. But after the day when he let her fall and gave her a big bump on the forehead, that kind of play ceased, and the boy, who had inherited his mother's talent for acting, was compelled to try some other make-believe than that of the tragedy on the wintry night many years before. Billy Peterkin has never married and never will, but he and Jerry are the best of friends, and he is very fond of her children, whom he often takes out in his dog-cart, holding Gretchen in his lap, while Tracy sits beside him with the lines, pretending to drive. Tom is still abroad, waiting for that fit of apoplexy which is to be the signal of his return. But the probabilities are that he will wait a long time, for Peterkin, who is himself afraid of apoplexy, has gone through the banting process, which has reduced his weight from 50 to 75 pounds, and as he is very careful in his diet, Tom may stay abroad longer than he cares to do, unless Annaliza's persuasions bring him home to his dreaded father-in-law. There was a little girl born to them in Rome whom they called Maud, but she only lived a few weeks, and then they buried her under the daisies in the Protestant burying ground where so many English and Americans are lying. And Eliza sent a lock of the little one's hair to her father, who had it framed and hung in his bedroom, and wore on his hat a band of crape which nearly covered it, while his wife was draped in black from head to foot, and looked, as Peterkin said, about as genteel as the Widder Tracy herself. Dolly still calls the Ridge cottage her home, but she is not often there, for a mania for travelling has seized her, and she is always upon the move in search of some new place where she hopes to find rest and quiet. She still dresses in black, relieved at times with something white, but she has laid aside crape and sports her diamonds, which she did not find it necessary to sell, and which attract a great deal of attention, they are so clear and large. One year she spent in Europe with Tom and Ann Eliza, the latter of whom she made so uncomfortable with her constant dictation and assumption of superiority that Tom at last came to the rescue, and told her either to mind her business and let his wife alone, or go home. As she could not do the former, she came home and joined a Raymond party to California, but soon separated herself from it, as the members were not to her taste, she said, and were constantly doing something to offend her aristocratic ideas. Every summer she goes either to Saratoga, or the seaside, or the mountains, and every winter she drifts southward to Florida, where at certain hotels she is as well known as the oldest habituée. She has a maid, and as far as possible keeps herself aloof from the common herd, consorting only with those who she knows have money and position at home. Poor foolish Dolly, who has forgotten Langley and its humble surroundings. There are many like her in real life, but only one in our story, to which we now write The End. Of Gretchen, by Mary Jane Holmes, recorded by Céline Major.